Heed my tale of time's beginning. All was dark. There was no sand. There was no sea. No earth, nor sky. No grass, nor wind. Till fire met ice in the gasping void.
Assassin's Creed Valhalla opens with a zooming shot of darkness, snow ripping past as a light in the center of the screen is approached gradually. A Norse-sounding woman invites you to hear her tale. It's a yarn of the death of Ymir, the giant of Norse mythology whose disfigured corpse would foster the establishment of life itself. Further and further the shot zooms until we land on an opening into an Old Norse longhouse, light spilling from the building as the ambience of some sort of festivity colors the landscape. Through that hole we find a young boy, excitedly retrieving a metal armband from a chest in a back room. He steps through an oaken door into a busy party, men and women 3 and 5 times his age celebrating something. In a move ripped straight out of a more cinematic, linear-style game, you're met with a hallway walking section where our young boy, Eivor, talks with many of the partygoers. A skald plays a song for him, every last person dancing and drinking their merry night away. Eivor quickly runs into his father, who reminds Eivor of his plan. Upon his father's command, he must take the metal armband he found and give it to Styrbjorn, their new king. Eivor's father recently struck a deal that would unite the two clans, and this tribute, coming from the old leader's son, would be an important show of goodwill between them. Wasting some small time, Eivor runs into the son of his new king, no older than 13 or 14, who offers Eivor a mug of mead. Eivor tells him of the tribute he must give his father, resulting in a loving chide from the older boy. He runs into another group who he has the opportunity to dance with, and finally his mom, who ruffles his hair and sends him on his way to the king. In receiving the gift from Eivor, he pledges his duty to Eivor and his people. Everyone in the hall begins to chant a song celebrating this new king. They sing of Valhalla and the many men and women who have bravely crossed over to it, both ages ago and in recent memory. As they finish up their singing, the main doors to the hall fling open. A man runs in, loudly proclaiming they're being attacked. Quickly, Eivor's father and mother run out, followed by their new king and his son, along with everyone else in the hall. Eivor is told to stay behind, but runs out as well. His mom kills an attacker and sets him up on a horse, telling him to ride. He does not listen, instead grabbing a sword off the ground and accidentally killing a man as he lays it down, attempting to climb through a window to get to his mother. Finally, the attacker himself, Kjotve the Cruel, shows his face. He offers Eivor's father a choice: die a coward in front of his whole clan and spare the lives of everyone else, or fall to his blade as his people are massacred, cementing the defeat of his clan. He decides to spare his clan, a decision which is met immediately with his death, as well as the betrayal of Kjotve's word. He kills everybody there, including Eivor's mother. The king's son rides by quickly on a horse, hoisting Eivor onto it before the both of them tumble off a cliff. Laying on the ice bloody, confused, and petrified, a wolf approaches Eivor. The wolf bites deep into his neck, shaking the boy. Eivor is then shown a vision of himself running to a closed door, his piercing screams scaring off the wolf temporarily. Ravens swoop down to protect the boy, pecking at the wolf until Eivor has time to grab an axe and finish the wolf off himself. It's an evocative start to say the least. It promises a very dark, very cinematic tone, reminiscent of one of the recent big-budget PS4 exclusive titles. This Viking world you're entering into isn't just going to be an excuse to make another open-world Assassin's Creed game. This is going to be a serious, enthralling experience filled with any hardship you can imagine a Viking having faced. This isn't a suggestion foregone by the gameplay either. In fact, the gameplay itself starts off rather strong, teasing you with the promise of a challenging, action-oriented survival experience. Immediately following the opening cutscenes and story introduction, Eivor, now adult-aged, wakes up in an enemy encampment and is ordered to be sold off as a slave in Ireland by the man who killed his parents.
That I will not allow. You will live your final days enthralled as a slave, humiliated. Your death will be a lonely one. Kill the rest of his crew! Make them suffer! Eivor Wolfkiss is no more! That name is dead to this world!
As the warlord leaves, Eivor fights off his captor, and finds himself entirely alone in the snowed-in tundra of Norway. With only a shirt on your back and an axe to defend yourself, you as the player are meant to find your way to safety, with only your raven friend to help you see at a distance. Playing as I did with a compass off, this means wandering around nearly entirely unguided through a snowed-in mystery isle. After climbing up a hill to leave the encampment, you find a small mountain nearby. Summiting that mountain gives you a view of the entire area surrounding you. Snowy plains, tall grass grown in from the end of the season before, rivers crossing on the coast making it evident that you're on a tiny island, another mountain yet closer, and more still after the horizon. Soaking it all in, I felt as though I was playing a new kind of game. Not a drastically different one that reinvents the wheel, but an experience which I couldn't immediately relate to anything I'd played before. The closest thing I can compare it to is what it felt like playing Skyrim for the first time in 2011. In this limitless, gorgeous world, you can always travel to what lies beyond the horizon and find new people and new stories. Only, this time the experience would be one I was more familiar with given all of the Viking-related media I'd been exposed to throughout the years. The world I was about to explore was handcrafted to fit what it might have looked like historically. I wasn't just playing a game. I was walking into a digital museum where the very ground I walked on, and the mountains I gazed at, told stories. The Viking man I walked around the world as could very well be an analog to some real-world Viking who might have had an experience similar to my avatar, or an amalgam of experiences had by many different Vikings who walked the earth well over a millennium ago. As I hopped off the mountain and began traversing through the snowy wilderness of the island I had been left on, I found an enemy encampment surrounding a strange glacier thing. This natural discovery gave me a feeling unique to what I had experienced playing Assassin's Creed games before. I'm not just walking through this world, I'm living in it, and I'm going to be able to discover every last corner of the world at my own leisure. This shift in gameplay and world design was emblematic of what the series had experienced over the last few entries. Assassin's Creed 3 was the last game in the franchise I had actually played to completion. I had touched Black Flag but never got far. The tedium of what you're asked to do in these games had got to me by that point. While you're promised a deeply immersive stealth action game by the trailers, what you're actually given is closer to a more cinematic version of a character action game, like 2005's God of War. It's replete with inconsequential side objectives, completed by using overly simplistic, hold one button and you're done platforming mechanics. The assassinations were a samey affair. Gather some clues to give you an idea of where the target is, approach as stealthily as you can, take out the target, and evade the guards while you escape. The worst part of these encounters was the simple, two-command, low reaction time combat. This made it so avoiding guards was more a matter of patience saving than gameplay necessity. There wasn't much of an ability to choose approach or assassination style, nor was there much of a way to escape a job without detection. You were locked into the approach the game wanted you to take. With Assassin's Creed Origins in 2016, Ubisoft promised to change all of that. Not only would you be given a lot more freedom in terms of gameplay, but combat would be drastically improved to amount to more than a bore. One of the standout changes to me was that the games would center on an open world as opposed to the semi-open, linear with 3 paths to choose from, with some side content added on, approach of entries previous. The worlds these games were set in would finally play a far bigger role in each game than they had historically. This was massive for me. One of the only reasons I cared about the game so much was because of their setting. Fictionalized history is an uncommon setting for any video game, but one that's entirely underrated. Having a predetermined but infinitely detailed setting makes for a great ability to focus on character development and storytelling without needing to invest so much time in creating an entirely new world for these characters to live in. Still, I never played Origins or Odyssey. Fearful of Ubisoft's inability to deliver on their promise of better games, Valhalla was my introduction to Neo Assassin's Creed. That prospect of a truly historical world is exactly what made this simple enemy encampment stand out to me so much. Watching the guards move around, it's clear they aren't from the same group of men who had been trying to sell you into slavery moments prior. These guards wear tattered leather armor and other odds and ends they may have found, such as unmatching helmets. They've set up camp around this glacier, a massive thing with ruined bridges and ladders attached. They're bandits, and this place is probably their home. While ascending the glacier, you're given hints of what once was. Skeletons laid to the side of the crippled and broken road, their earthly belongings now laid next to their corpse, presumably dead in pursuit of whatever great reward lay at the top of the thing. Reaching that summit, you are met with a treasure chest carrying some resource you're not entirely sure yet how to use. Perhaps a bit disappointed, or distracted with thoughts of what it is you just grabbed, you're suddenly distracted by the view you get from the top. Not just of the world in the great distance, glorious mountains and steel sky, but of the environment immediately surrounding you. You get to see everything about the bandit camp from high up, whatever small settlement there is. You get to see whatever bandits you did not kill wandering around on their predetermined patrols, walking back and forth to protect their small claim from any potential invader. It comes without question that Assassin's Creed Valhalla is a gorgeous game, and not just for its graphical detail. It's a gorgeous game because of its marriage to detail, for the stories that are crafted from that vision and the sense of world that comes from those stories. While many open world games have done exactly what I've described here, few have ever been set so effectively in such a detailed world. These NPCs have lives in this historical world that they will continue to live even when you shut off the game. What matters is not the small amount of silver you get from the sack next to the skeleton, but the placement of the skeleton and the environment around it. What matters is not the treasure you get at the summit of the mountain, but the person who died in pursuit of it, and the affirmation that what they were searching for was indeed a reality, and that their death was not entirely in vain. What matters is the fact that the story will stick with you long after you leave that glacier and wander to greener pastures. It is a small sentence in the tome that is Assassin's Creed Valhalla. What stands out to me so much about the game is the sense of world that pops out as a result of the culmination of all of these little efforts, aided only in part by the insane level of graphical fidelity. It's for this reason that Valhalla reminds me of the awe I first felt playing Skyrim so many years ago. It's an overtly unique, immersive experience in these first few moments, perhaps unmatched by most open world games I've spent any serious time with. This section culminates in you sneaking up on Kjotve's outpost on the island. Trapped inside of the longhouse are the many allies you traveled here with. allies who are now threatened to be killed as a result of your capture. While optional before, sneaking past the guards in this town is paramount. You're still without armor, and the men here are no mere bandits. They don't actually attack any differently, but there's far too many to take on at once. You're meant to discover an open window in the top of the longhouse, a secret entrance through which you can surprise the man keeping your friends hostage. You drop in, and after a short verbal back and forth, you're thrown into your first boss battle. You're introduced to a few important mechanics here. Past normal attacks, some enemies have strong and unparryable attacks. The strong ones summon a yellow symbol above the enemy's head, and you must be prepared to parry or dodge or take massive damage. The unparryable attacks summon a red version of the same symbol and leave you with no choice but to dodge. The fight itself is simple to navigate, but your lack of armor makes the fights unnecessarily punishing for what may very well be many players' first fight. You take one hit and half of your health is gone. As we'll soon come to learn, it's painfully antithetical to what the rest of the combat sets itself up to be. Immediately following the boss fight, Eivor has a PTSD episode. He witnesses Odin opening some massive doors, light flooding through as Eivor races toward him. Stepping through the door, he sees a massive tree. The sky is red and it's raining ash. Abruptly, he's awoken by his teammates yelling at him to untie them. He grabs his armor after doing so, while the lot make fun of him for taking his little break. Recollected and rejuvenated, they burst out of the main doors of the longhouse and face the rest of the outpost head-on. Your group fights theirs in a series of big one-on-one battles as you progress toward your boat. You're able to burst into many of the various houses spread throughout and grab whatever treasure you can find. Finishing up the area, you sail back to your hometown.
Craggy, grab your oars. The whale road leads us home.
That hometown is a massive break from the intro island I'd come to love. Contrasted against the snowy landscape, wild animals, and ruins overrun with bandits is a quaint little village. An armorer welcomes you with open arms like an old friend. Old women gossip on the side of the road. A storyteller weaves tales of the gambits, trials, and tribulations of the gods. Another man beckons you to play him in a dice game for a wager. All of it is complemented by the ambient hustle and bustle of a small village with many working parts. It's a sweet little break from the Desolace you experienced earlier, focused more on situational world building than pure exploration. Some of the characters are interactive, allowing you to discover the different activities and resources you can come to expect from the main areas later on in the game, while still learning about the characters who offer them. Through these interactions, as well as additional side quests, the character of Eivor is fleshed out more than what combat alone could convey. The intro sets him up as a tragic character, his parents killed by the man who he has now made his life's purpose to kill. The conversations show him to be a man matured, though still reserved. In the years since his father's untimely death, the man who was supposed to become Eivor's new king in the ceremony which opens the game has adopted him, making him somewhat of a prince in the village. In spite of his important role, it's clear that he's skeptical of the intentions of others. He's conversational, though not quite friendly. In spite of that reservedness, his voice betrays a lot of emotion, the source of which we're not yet certain. That emotion comes entirely from the fantastic voice acting of Magnus Brun Nielsen. It's possible the female Eivor is voiced equally as well, though I haven't played as her. Presume all of the stuff here applies to her as well. Eivor must meet with his father to discuss what occurred, but before he can do so, he has to run a couple of errands around town. Namely, he wants to speak with the town's seer woman about the episode he experienced earlier. She prescribes him what can only be a psychedelic cocktail, something which knocks him out minutes later. In his dream, he witnesses a man running from the cabin. Thinking it's the seer woman, he gives chase. After sprinting up a small hill, he sees 3 women surrounding a pond working on massive old weaving stands. At the other end of the pond is the man, now easily identifiable as Odin, the same man we saw from the episode earlier. Eivor sprints after him once more, following him through gates which are too identical to those in the vision. On the other side, he finds his adoptive brother, Sigurd, with his left arm gone past the elbow. He tells Eivor it's your fault before being snatched away by a massive wolf. Bursting from the dream in a cold sweat, the seer woman has him explain what he's seen. She says that what he experienced was no dream, it was a prophecy. Eivor is to betray his brother, who will suffer greatly for it. She says that the presence of the Weavers seal it. They are the Nornir, the Weavers of Fate. In watching Eivor's interaction with Odin, they were forging Eivor's destiny. She tells him that Odin is visiting him for a reason, that he's destined to be great, and that he should not fight that destiny, no matter who must suffer on the way there.
Betray Sigurd.
Odin fought against his fate. It can be done.
Eivor steps inside of the town's longhouse as his father's finishing a meeting with a guest. His father is not happy. Saying goodbye to the guest, he chastises you for forcing a conflict with Kjotve on your own and betraying the will of the clan. His will. You snap back at him for doing nothing while he threatens your land and kills your people. You tell him that the king's own biological son, Sigurd, would agree with him. The king responds that his son may, but he knows when to obey his father. The king is uncomfortable with Eivor's will and doesn't quite know what to do with him. He questions how a son of the man he was once so close with could disrespect him so. Like an edgy teenager, Eivor claims that his father died a dishonorable man and that his only goal in life is to clear away that stain on his legacy. The king is deeply distraught by his second son's demons. He's not only worried that Eivor will threaten the stability of the clan, but that he'll lose one of his children in the process. Saved by the bell, Sigurd's wife, Randvi, comes running in alerting the two that Sigurd has finally arrived. Gone for some significant period at sea, his ship is finally docked in his hometown. Eivor runs out of the longhouse to reunite with his brother. Only he's not alone. Two hooded men, more Anatolian than Norse, step out of Sigurd's longboat alongside him. He introduces them as Hytham and Basim, men he met as guides during one of his many excursions. In spite of the conflict with his adoptive father, Eivor's bond with his brother did not seem to at all diminish during his time at sea. While his interactions with his father show the edgy emotions which underlie Eivor's reserved exterior, his reunification with Sigurd shows a childlike excitement. In spite of his attitude, he's still an emotional little man. On the walk back to the longhouse to greet his father, Sigurd speaks with Eivor about his kidnapping. Word travels faster than he does, apparently. Eivor informs him that he personally slaughtered his captors and made his way back home, a fact for which their father is none too happy. He reminds Sigurd that the only way to deal with Kjotve is to rid him from their lands violently, something Sigurd immediately affirms as though he's thought about nothing else his whole trip. Randvi too is happy to see her husband return, though they don't share much more than a quick embrace in front of the longship. She stands aside Sigurd while he speaks to his father, though seems to be nothing more than a wallfly watching the two interact. Rejoicing in front of her, the king tells Sigurd of the feast he's to throw in his honor, a notion which Sigurd accepts on the condition his father do nothing more. I guess humility is what fuels the Vikings' raids. Actually, Sigurd does seem to have one other condition, that they prepare for war against Kjotve as soon as the celebrations are through. Subtly dismissing him, the king beckons his son's wife, and Eivor into the longhouse for a jump cut to when the festivities begin. In front of a crowd of warriors and townsfolk, Sigurd regales his escapades as though they were legend. As he finishes, he beckons Eivor to his side so he may present him with a gift. He leads you to Hytham and Basim, Sigurd's new friends you met earlier. In an optional dialogue with Basim before you speak with Sigurd, he tells you of the passion he's drawn to in your brother. Specifically, he says it's as if a forgotten memory of an old friendship had suddenly resurfaced. Interesting wording. In speaking to Sigurd and after some drinking, he calls Hytham and Basim over. He informs you of their clan, a brotherhood drawn together by a common philosophy in the distant land of the Abbasid Caliphate. Shortly afterward, he hands you your gift, something which he claims is one example of the secrets of the Brotherhood. It's the ever-so-famous wrist blade from every other Assassin's Creed entry. Hytham is very hesitant to allow you to receive the thing. He claims that it's a memento of the Brotherhood's training and that outsiders should not be allowed to wear it. Seemingly enthusiastic that Eivor should receive the weapon, Basim tells Hytham to stand by. Though said in an optional conversation with Hytham earlier, it's clear that Basim is Hytham's mentor. Hytham has a deep respect for Basim, and he's willing to see even the most exclusive rituals of his order desecrated should his master tell him so. Basim, on the other hand, is mysterious. If it really is such an important item, why is he so comfortable with letting an outsider freely wield it? What's more, Eivor outright disrespects the tradition further by wearing the blade on the upper side of his wrist as opposed to the bottom. Basim expresses no qualm with this, merely pausing before saying that he's off to a good start. If the order truly is so ritualistic, he's not doing a very good job as an ambassador for it. On a walk outside, Basim tells you he'd inform you more of a secret order behind closed doors. This leads directly into a sequence where the game teaches you how to use the wrist blade to assassinate straw men. There's not much to say about this. Like other stealth action games, you hide in waiting temporarily before pressing an attack button to take out the enemies. Hytham, still wary of Eivor's possession of the blade, departs to his lodgings with Basim. Down by the docks, Eivor questions whether Sigurd intends to join this shadowy brotherhood. Sigurd, as though taken by a spirit of adventure, assures him that not only is he back in the clan for good, but that he intends to take the war to Kjotve on the morrow. Eivor compliments Sigurd on his clear-headedness, affirms his loyalty, and heads off to bed. Awoken by a dream of his prophecy, Eivor hears hurried steps from outside of his hut. Looking down the road, he finds a warrior in enemy cloth, running. He assassinates the man after a quick chase, resolving that he must have come with some allies. Finding their camp, you discover 2 more men. They're all spies from Kjotve's clan. This is the first time the game asks you to participate in real stealth work. Though the intro section did see you sneaking past enemies, it's only with the wrist blade that you're able to perform stealth takedowns. It's quite clever that this comes immediately after its tutorial section too. It is standard to include regular gameplay sequences necessitating a mechanic right after its introduction. Still, to have story-relevant cutscenes sandwiched between, leading to a real encounter with enemies that affirm the conflict the main characters are so focused on, is done incredibly naturally. Dare I say, somehow too natural for an Assassin's Creed game. Maybe RPG was a good step for the series. Maybe. After killing the spies, Eivor runs down to the docks to find his brother and father already arguing about raiding Kjotve's lands. Eivor steps in covered in blood, informing his father, who is also the king, that the blood is from Kjotve's spies. Hesitant as he may be without the manpower for a full-scale war, he seems to understand that this is a slight he cannot overlook. Before setting off, Basim decides to come along with Hytham. He seems eager to insert himself in their decades-old conflict. For the second time, it's difficult to tell what Basim's motivation is. It makes sense that he wants to be Sigurd's friend, but to put his and his pupils' necks on the line for some random Viking? Still, they set off with the intention of pillaging one of Kjotve's towns. From a story perspective, the confrontation is minimal. From a gameplay perspective, this section builds off the end of the intro in an interesting way. Where that section saw you merely killing a load of enemies and escaping, this next section sees you shooting explosive barrels, actually pots, to set houses in the village on fire, while also ravaging through loads of bad dudes. At the end of the sequence, the man your father met with in that sequence 20 minutes ago shows up. He reveals his name to be Guthorm. Behind him is his nephew, Harold Fairhair, the king of the lands to the north. He does not chastise you for your violence, instead offering you aid in ridding Kjotve from the lands once and for all. Where Sigurd is eager, Eivor is wary. He questions Harold's motives, though the pretty king claims he merely wants to resolve a conflict on his southern border. He invites Sigurd to come to his capital once the fighting is done to celebrate, and leaves his men in Sigurd's hands. In the background, Basim stands with his arms crossed, silently observing. Convenient friends at every turn, it seems. The next time you see Sigurd is at a forward camp downstream from Kjotve's keep. You, Guthorm, and Sigurd all resolve to confront Kjotve as soon as possible. Harold's force combined with yours is far and away enough to take out your enemy. As you step out from Sigurd's command tower, Basim asks you for a word. Next to him stands Hytham, the man he claims to be his closest ally in the fight against Kjotve's order. Not clan, but order. He claims that Kjotve's group has been threatening their own for centuries, and taking out Kjotve will put them one step closer to eradicating that threat. Not only that, he intends for Hytham to be the one to kill him. He's been studying him for months, and it seems as though assassinating Kjotve would cap off some sort of job or ritual he's taken on. Eivor's having none of it, though Hytham doesn't seem too bothered. At the gates of Kjotve's keep, Eivor challenges Kjotve to a holmgang, a personal duel to the death. He intends for this to be the day he reclaims his honor besoiled by the death of his father. What ensues is the first real boss fight of the game. Yes, there was one at the beginning, but this one is better. It also reflects what you've learned so far throughout your short time with the game, something the first fight inherently can't do. Many of the mechanics present in this boss fight with Kjotve are present in that first fight too, only faster here. You're made to dodge more big attacks and feel more confident parrying the ones you're able to. The boss also has multiple phases, the first of which involves him charging at you and swinging with his bare fists. The second sees him grabbing his two axes so he can throw out even more big attacks that you have no choice but to dodge. Midway through this second phase, Kjotve charges at you once more and shoves you through a wooden barricade down to a pit below. Immediately after landing, Hytham comes flying through the air in an attempt to kill Kjotve. As Eivor shouts for him to stop, Hytham's flung into a wall by Kjotve before the fight continues. In beating Kjotve, a cutscene plays. We enter into a misty, watery void. Trees sprout from the ground very suddenly, and for the third time we see Odin. He doesn't say much. He saves the speaking for Kjotve. Kjotve congratulates you on your ability to kill him, but taunts you with the irrelevance of your lineage. Every time he shouts some sort of threat at Eivor, Odin stomps the ground with a staff and tosses Kjotve around like a ragdoll. Kjotve's an enemy in this dream sequence, and Odin uses him as his plaything. Finally, he sprouts a massive tree through Kjotve, impaling him. He makes one final comment on doing what he needed to survive where all others were too scared to, the thing he believes will be his legacy. A raven emerges from his mouth with a token in its own mouth, a medallion emblazoned with the insignia of a tree, dropping it into Eivor's hands. With that, the sequence ends. These dream sequences are standard following the assassination of a target in Assassin's Creed games, but this game does something unique with the concept that I haven't seen many else do. This sequence serves as an opportunity for Eivor to show some kind of emotion. Where he's bullheaded with others when talking about what Kjotve did to his father, he sounds fearful at the prospect of his legacy being wiped away to nothing. As he shouts in protest, Odin slams the staff and punishes Kjotve. These two characters play off each other, though one is ever silent. It's as though Odin is Eivor's psyche, protecting him and being the only man to listen to his cries. As he awakes, Kjotve's son, Gorm, taunts Eivor into attacking his keep. He seems confident that he can win if he hides behind his tall stone wall. A stone wall that Eivor immediately scales when the cutscene ends. You climb a ladder and break open the main doors of the keep so your small army can flood in. Following the first two simple raids, the game leads you into the first complete one in a pretty natural way. At the very start of the game, you're left with much of nothing on your person. You have no armor and only a measly axe to escape the island you're trapped on. It isn't outright difficult, but feels like a mild war of attrition. Part of the challenge this early on comes from the fear you feel being undergeared. You simply do not know who you can kill and how fast. The combat itself is a simple, Souls-esque system where you lock onto an enemy, wait for them to attack, then block, dodge, parry, or sidestep said attack, and finally approach during the opening left afterwards to smack the enemy in the face. Only it doesn't have the same tight timing or punishing animations that Dark Souls does. The game doesn't care much at all if you time attacks poorly, and you can easily cancel most of them into dashes if you do. On top of this, both you and your enemy's damage and health are balanced in such a way where you're able to take them out as quickly as possible without much repercussion. For as simple as it is, it actually works in Valhalla's favor quite well. It's a full frontal style of combat, focused on you dismembering enemies as quickly and efficiently as possible. It's like a third-person action RPG Doom game, only far less challenging. It gets you through each and every single enemy encounter with great speed to focus you back on what you probably care about more: exploration and resource gathering. While you might get hit hard if you leave yourself open in combat, finding space to fuck up like that is genuinely difficult. The game wants you to beat back every single enemy with ease, no matter the difficulty setting or your equipment level. As the intro progresses, the combat is confined into smaller villages and combined notably with environmental destruction in the second raid. This builds the feeling that you're wreaking havoc on some enemy's homestead as a real Viking may have. The raid on Kjotve's keep escalates that feeling further. The core loop of approach, wait for a second and react, is accelerated by new gear and better weapons. Naturally, there are also far more enemies around, a fact which both aids and detracts from the core combat loop in equal parts. While you are able to mow through all of the enemies far faster when there's loads of them around you, it also becomes far harder to address the actions coming from every single individual enemy. It's easy to get into a situation where you parry an enemy in front of you, see another attack flying at you from the side, go to parry again and have it miss completely, taking damage in the process. It's also possible to have the next enemy attack start to come out before you're even able to parry again, or to dodge. It's also possible to have an enemy that was completely out of view hit you, something you couldn't have reacted to in the first place given the limited FOV the camera has when you're attacking one specific enemy. While it's something that isn't overly hindering, it gives the combat a sort of disconnected feeling. One-on-one or in an incredibly small group, the combat works just fine. In a group of 4 or more, or when surprise attacked, the enemies entirely dictate the pace of combat while you're left doing nothing but reacting to them, waiting for some opportunity to attack. Even when that opportunity is there, you're still liable to get hit in the middle of the attack animation. As such, combat in groups ends up being reliant on the balance of you being godly strong and the enemies being ants in comparison. Even when you do get opened up, the damage dealt by the enemies is usually low enough and the hit stun short enough for it to almost never mean you're going to die. It's a system that makes you feel strong, but not because of anything you've actually done. In the end of it all, Gorm escapes unharmed and Eivor weeps. Following the raid, Eivor returns to Harald's capital to celebrate their victory. Sitting next to Sigurd and Basim at a table in a small tavern, he spots Gorm on the other side of the room. He's celebrating his escape as though it were a victory. Eivor tells Sigurd he wishes to cut Gorm's throat then and there, though Sigurd warns him to not break Harald's peace. Gorm smiles at the crowd before leaving for his camp. Sigurd takes off to escort his father to Harald's longhouse, leaving Basim and Eivor on their own. Basim asks Eivor if he found a medallion on Kjotve's body. Eivor places it on the table, and in return, Basim promises Eivor a way to sneak into Gorm's camp unnoticed. Seems like Basim has a fondness for stirring shit. Skeptical of the honor in sneaking up on your enemy, Eivor follows Basim anyway. He teaches Eivor how to sneak, no weapons, hood up, walk slowly, and blend into crowds wherever possible. He barges into Gorm's lodgings undetected, challenging him to a duel past his camp's walls. Gorm declines, and some of Harald's guards barge in after a punch to pick Eivor up by his arms and carry him away like a writhing child at nap time. After some cursing, he does so, figuring that temporary peace is better than making a new enemy. Upon finally entering Harald's longhouse, Eivor is welcomed to the beginning of a meeting between many prominent figures in Norway. Harald begins his speech nearly immediately after Eivor's arrival. He speaks of the greatness of his father and of his dream to unite the disparate clans in Norway, a plan he's determined to carry out by appointing himself king. Some decline the offer and declare their intention to sail to England. Gorm, on the other hand, fully welcomes Harald's rule. Surprisingly, it's Harald that declines Gorm's loyalty. Harald gives the player the choice of how to respond, and I chose to exile him. He leaves rather unceremoniously. I'm sure there will be no other point in the game where he shows up. Next, Sigurd's father stands before Harald and accepts Harald's rule. Surprised and angered, Sigurd steps forth and berates his father for suddenly giving up his title, the title that Sigurd was meant to carry following his death. Angered, Sigurd storms out of the longhouse, his father following close behind. Denying a job offer from Harald, Eivor too takes his leave. The rest plays out rather quickly. The next day, Sigurd and much of the rest of the village hide in their hometown's longhouse, out of sight from Harald's soldiers' newfound presence. After a short conversation, the lot of them agree to take off to England with Sigurd and Eivor. You're given a minor choice here which partially dictates the ending of the game. You can either take the spoils of war gotten from Kjotve's camp with you to England, or you can leave them for your father, the technical owner of it. My first time around, I chose to leave it. This is the right decision, but you really don't find that out for another 100 hours. The king shows up to berate Sigurd and Eivor for their choice before marching off, and you and the gang finally sail off to England. The first time playing this game, I remember this intro sequence taking me 10 hours. The second time, it took me 3. In either case, you spend a very non-insubstantial amount of time loitering around Norway. This is a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, you spend anywhere from the length of an itch.io game to a Castlevania Symphony of the Night True Ending playthrough in a glorified tutorial area. On the other hand, it's so fleshed out as to become a miniature game of its own. A mini tutorial game. Kjotve's terror is set up in an opening sequence resembling that of a more condensed action game, and resolved only a short while later. The extent to which Eivor's past troubles him is introduced in the first gameplay section, and that too is resolved with the death of Kjotve. Valhalla introduces you to its depth of gameplay through the action sequences these story beats are nestled into. It's just a shame the credits didn't roll at the end of it all. With not a single unresolved plotline connecting Norway and England, it's hard to see how the two connect. I share with you all of the excruciating detail laid out in the paragraphs above, not to aggressively beat you over the head with every experience I've ever had, but to contrast this section and the next. It's hard not to feel like the game either doesn't have anywhere new to go, or that everything else we just witnessed will be irrelevant to the rest of the spectacular game set before us. My first time playing the game, I believed the latter. Writing this, I know it's the former. Still, the England that you find on the other end of that ocean sailing cutscene is far more beautifully detailed than anything built in Norway. What stood out to me first was the massive, crumbling, ancient Roman architecture. While I am fully knowledgeable of Rome's influence on early Britannia, I was still taken aback by the sheer attention to detail of this one marbled beauty alone. Similar to that island in the intro, I felt as though there was a story to discover here. A story not just of the ancients who once landed, conquested, and colonized the lands, but of the numerous generations who have come and gone since they left. Moving further down the river, you're ambushed by a group of bandits who have the river crossing blocked off. Using a river chain, they stop your boat and begin to fire arrows at you. You have no choice but to hop out and deal with them on foot. One of the first things you notice as you approach are their distinct outfits. While the warriors of Norway wear loads of heavy-looking leather with helmets obscuring much of their face, the English sport lighter tunics underneath not much more than leather chest plates. They do have helmets, though their outfits suggest a focus on agility and quick combat, as opposed to long-form, back-and-forth battles to the death. Such are the Anglo-Saxon enemies we can come to expect for much of the rest of England. Killing them and moving further down the river, you finally land on a settlement which Sigurd believes to have been held by Guthrum Jarl and his great heathen army. Expecting a warm welcome from Viking brethren, you're met with nothing but moss, decay, and more Anglo-Saxons. After a short confrontation, it's clear these people aren't too fond of Vikings. You killed a lot of them and breached the Longhouse, finding 2 former residents of the village, their hands bound behind their backs. They make it clear that they don't know what happened to Guthrum, saying they returned to the village to find everyone gone. In the absence of any kind of friendly Viking guide, Sigurd determines the abandoned village will be your new home. He names it Ravensthorpe after your people, the Raven clan. It's this small settlement that serves as one of the first real gameplay implementations into the environment around you. Much like the settlement in Fallout 4, it's your job to build up this small claim into something which the whole clan can be proud of, and which has a culture much of its own. Of course, you'll need resources to actually accomplish this, a fact which brings us back to the raids. I'll dive into these again in more detail later, but for now, all you really need to know is these act much as the same from earlier, only you invade exclusively by river now. You find a raid spot on the map, select the raid option from your boat, and progressively fight and burn your way through the place until you can secure whatever resources are hidden throughout. They're spread out all across the map, and it's up to you when you decide to complete them. Heading back to the village, Sigurd quickly decides to take his leave. He's off to help some men who have been in these lands for a while, Ubba and Ivar Ragnarsson. He's seeking to install a new king of Mercia, the kingdom you're currently in order to better secure Viking influence. Bassam follows him not far behind, leaving Hytham behind in the village. You're also told of a Viking settlement in Grantebridgeshire to the immediate south, which may be in danger. From here, it's entirely up to you which direction you want to pursue. Given the magnitude of the land you're in, it's the first time this decision has really made you feel like you're in an open world. The land itself is massive, the map unveiling 16 different zones you can travel to. While you're technically meant to travel in the direction of whatever quest you chose, you're perfectly free to go any which way you please. Mountains, rivers, and roads surround you on all sides. The only limit is the time you have to play the game. It's a game with no shortage of different ways to get you to your destination either. You're free to travel by longboat with your crew across the many different interwoven rivers of England. You can travel on horseback across the roads laid in and across the countryside to get you to any of the major cities. All of the fields and woods between said roads are yours to explore on foot. It's up to you to discover the many different people and opportunities that lay within this new countryside. While the land itself is massive, it provides only the groundwork for the scope of the world. The opportunities within the world are the things which make it feel grandiose. There's loads of motivators to get you to run around the world and do whatever it is you choose. You have the raids to help build up your settlement, the quests you're given to better understand the world around you and help plant the roots of your influence, and all of the loads of different, smaller choices in between. You can climb up every different viewpoint to slowly discover the map. You can hunt down treasure, which will give you more resources and more meaningful rewards like gear. You can hunt down new and unique things to do which may not have been present at all in Norway. Each and every one of these things is tracked on the map so you can keep easy progress of how much more you have to complete to finish everything in the area. Complementing each of these are the environmentally told stories introduced in Norway. Characters may tell you of the goings-on within each area, but the details strewn about give you a far better rapport than people could ever hope to. Some viewpoints, for example, may be on the top of major buildings and cities, while others may be on the top of once-thought unscalable mountains. On a more macro level, there are gameplay inclusions like different cultures having enemies with different armor and accents. From a gameplay perspective, they may be the same as all of the other NPCs and enemies you encounter normally, but their unique appearance adds an extra bit of flavor to the different and new-looking areas you often encounter. Perhaps the strongest backbone for this whole system are the random encounters with the denizens of England, called mysteries by the game. They're sort of akin to side quests, only significantly shorter. They're fast, to the point, and don't typically get bogged down in anything other than the immediate task at hand, allowing you to quickly pick up one of them on the way to something like a main quest. All of these mysteries are incredibly varied, with no central theme tying them together. In some, you'll be choosing between helping a wild animal man in a cave, or the mob of people outside it who want him dead. Sometimes you'll be taking magic mushrooms and fighting off seals, while other times you'll be shooing away a music-hating priest so an early medieval rock band can get back to playing for their crowd. The encounter with the Reaper in East Anglia stands out most to me. He's a normal-seeming character who informs you of a great tragedy that befell some people below the hill from him. Traveling down, you're met with bodies strewn about a tree. Investigating informs you of their run-in with a buried pile of money, and the betrayal they were all met with at the hands of others in the group. The money is laid on the ground for you to take, and heading back up the hill to speak with the man, you're met only with a note filled with names of people only you know to be dead, such as Kjotve the Cruel. The purpose of these small, short stories is twofold. On one hand, they give you a break from the primary story beat you're on or the exploration you're engaging in, while on the other hand offering a unique way of fleshing out the world. In between all of the smaller inclusions are the story quests you're meant to complete, and I really do mean in between. Even in the immediate vicinity of any quest marker, you can find dozens of side activities. Treasure to collect, mysteries to complete, gear to find. The quests themselves tend to be straightforward affairs you might find in any RPG. You speak to some NPC, get introduced to the story, then are asked to complete any of a number of different activities that all still tend to revolve around fetch quests or open-air combat arenas. Even in the middle of any of these quests, you're free to change course and complete any otherworldly activities you can find. In a lot of cases, it outright feels like you're encouraged to do so. The game will often ask you to travel long distances to complete the objective of a quest. This can involve finding goods, killing enemies, or getting to an important place. Along the way are yet more dozens of mysteries, viewpoints, treasure, and more. Their presence is so naturally woven into the environment that these side events blend into the main story, feeling not like a tangent to, but a primary constituent of your experience. The first moment I really felt this was taking out Wigmund in Grantebridgeshire. You're meant to raid the Isle of Ely Monastery to take out Wigmund, a member of the Order of the Ancients, the bad guy organization Kjotve belong to. He's a fat, greedy merchant, and he's taken over the Viking settlement of Grantebridge belonging to Soma. He's subjugating anyone of non-Anglo-Saxon ethnicity, the exact reason you're called to the area. In taking him out, you free the region and allow for the proliferation of the Viking lifestyle quashed under his rule. After I killed him, I was chased by guards and had to flee through the marshes on the back half of the island. Traveling not too far into the island, I'm met with a creeping fog covering my screen and making it harder to navigate. The guards all disappear and I can't quite figure out where I am. I stumble around for a bit, climbing over rocks and mounds until I'm met with an arena. Dead bodies lay strewn about, some with spears driven through their chests and others decapitated. Every last person killed in some gruesome fashion. I investigate one of the bodies when suddenly a big-tittied, bare-chested Viking warrior woman pops out of nowhere and claims I killed her father, attacking me immediately afterward. I'm killed in a matter of seconds without incurring much damage. I mark the area for later and stay far away from it, terrified not just of the difficult battle, but of the woman who lurks on that island. Each and every one of these smaller actions tie into the ones around it to weave a sense of a greater world around you. You're able to switch frequently from questing to exploring to looting, giving you the freedom both in a gameplay and a world sense to explore and do whatever it is you please, while still giving you the sensation that you're actually consistently accomplishing something. Encounters like the one with the female Viking mini-boss, Goneril, give flavor to the world, informing you of the places you can and can't feel confident traveling to and completing the objectives. Valhalla offers you a massive world on a silver platter and asks you to go any which way you please, but punishes you for sticking your nose in places where it doesn't yet belong. This limit gives the world a sense of danger, but also of promise. What lay at the end of your fight with Goneril may very well be worth the risk. It forces you to make a mental mark of the places of danger, and asks you to caution another attempt once you're powerful enough. It takes the naturally built world introduced to you with the environments in Norway, slaps on a reason for you to visit, and stacks enough of these encounters on top of one another to build a beautiful world. A world whose importance lies just as much with the experiences you've had in it as it does with its gorgeous design. Still, the game does tend to suffer as a result of its exploration system coming entirely from Assassin's Creed games before it. You're often not encouraged to interact with the world around you as you explore, instead encouraged to focus on the map and compass to navigate. The compass guides you to any objectives or treasure you could need to find, while the map documents them all for you exactly. When the location of everything you could possibly need in the game is given to you with pinpoint accuracy, it's hard to justify ever using the clues given by the world itself to find what you need. This is further exacerbated by the presence of Odin's Sight. By holding down R3 for a brief period, you're shown every single last enemy, bit of treasure, and quest marker in your immediate vicinity, even through walls. The only thing you're left to figure out on your own is basic navigation through the environment and how to solve the puzzles blocking you from getting to your goal. While completing these objectives does necessitate some sort of interaction with the contents of the world, The lack of natural discovery makes completing everything within it feel like marking things off a checklist. You do have the option to turn off the compass and easy quest objectives list as I did, and while this did remove any UI abstractions from the screen, it actually served to make questing and exploring far more difficult. There are typically no in-world indicators as to where the next quest bit or piece of treasure may be, forcing you to rely on Odin's sight, the map, and your raven, Sunan, all the more to find where you're meant to be next. While Sunan does provide an alternative to the compass which you actually have control over, his lack of any serious gameplay alternative to what Odin's sight and the map does makes him effectively useless. He's only good for finding where discovery areas are meant to be in quests. With all that being said, I found that when I did turn the compass on, I was focused less on figuring out how to traverse the roads and paths in the world, and more on blindly following the arrow pointing me in the direction I needed to go. A lot of the beauty of the world was lost to me in constantly staring at the top of the screen. It's a situation where you must take your pick between sacrificing accessibility for immersion or vice versa. There simply is no middle ground, in spite of Ubisoft's best attempt. Still, the world you find behind that UI is just as striking as it's always been. As I've already mentioned time and time again, the world is gorgeous, probably one of the best worlds we've seen up to this point graphically. What is so unique about the design of the world though, the thing that actually makes it pop out, is how the developers apply the historical setting of the world. You're not just running and questing around a facsimile of early medieval England, you're engaged in a recreation of it. Great attention is placed in making the world itself feel as lived in and as accurate to the time as possible. Roads between cities and the things happening aside them feel as though they are present simply to demonstrate what may have actually been happening at the time, as well as to give you some light gameplay effect to engage with. On the road which serves as one of the entrances to Norwich, stumps of trees sit where a logging effort once clearly took place. On many roads spread all across the game, bandits are liable to jump out at you and fight you as highwaymen might have attempted to back in that time. Many of the cities within England are constituted of the ruins left behind by the Romans so many centuries ago. It is actually rarer to find a city made entirely of newer buildings than it is to find one of repurposed ruins. The only places in which the reverse is the case are the Norse settlements, such as Jorvik. London itself is situated almost entirely in the Roman settlement abandoned so long ago, Londinium. People have found new ways to survive in the once thriving outpost, now rendered dilapidated and ruined. What is less fun is how little you can actually engage with these fascinating areas or the people within them. There is no doubt the room for a story to be told in every nook and cranny in London alone. Why is it that people selected the buildings they did to repurpose? What exactly is it that they're pursuing? What is their purpose? Their story? It's reasonable to think that the developers simply didn't have time to flesh out the world in this way. When developing a game in a AAA environment, you get a choice in what you're going to dedicate the most of your time to. And in this case, it seemed as though they settled on fleshing out the architectural detail of the cities. Still, it's hard not to feel like the end product is a bit empty, given how little story they plastered on those mosaic walls. Valhalla is still a video game at the end of the day, and to feel like any of the assets included within it are meaningful, you need some unique way to interact with them. The most you do with many of these assets is simply look at them. Even the unique encounters with people like the highwaymen see you killing the enemies you're faced with before going back on your merry way with little in the way of choice in how you interact with them. Still, there is something to be said for Ubisoft's unique dedication to historical accuracy. It's just hard not to imagine that this sort of thing would have worked better in a walk-around, informational sandbox type experience, like something you'd see a museum curate, or like what we eventually saw with the exploration modes added to Origins and Odyssey. Back to exploration and looting. The absolute most important element of these encounters is combat. Some worldly encounters, like the viewpoints, do not involve any combat unless they're encased within an enemy area. Even then, combat is only an ancillary effect, limiting you from getting to your goal. Other encounters don't just require combat, but include it as an outright necessary part of the experience. One instance of this is the enemy encampments you run into throughout the world. Typically present for some story-important reason, though not always, these areas are replete with anywhere from 5 to 25 guards depending on the size of the camp, or the importance of the thing they're guarding. Spread throughout the camp are treasure chests, typically hidden away in enemy tents or small corners of the area, as well as things like ore nodes. These chests contain the resources you need to upgrade things like your max ration count or max arrow count, as well as to upgrade your gear, leading to these camps being a necessity to clear out. You're able to open many of these chests without alerting the guards, and the ones you do alert, you can typically take out silently before anyone else realizes what's happening. Of course, this isn't always possible. Messing up while sneaking is incredibly easy, what with the sheer quantity of guards in places like this, and when you're caught, you have no choice but to fight. The feeling of combat doesn't change much as the game progresses either. Each and every single combat encounter follows the same pattern as that first raid in Norway. Enemies approach you, you parry them to open them up, or otherwise hit them until they're dead, and focus on the next enemy. What does change are the types of enemies, and the level of your character. The enemies you encounter are of two types. Standard, low health enemies who do not deal much damage and die quickly and quietly, typically getting dismembered before they overstay their welcome. The other enemies could best be described as elites. They aren't quite as powerful as bosses, but retain unique fighting styles, as well as higher health bars and damage output. Some of their moves are more powerful or more difficult to counter versions of the attacks the weaker enemies dole out, while others are wide sweeps and powerful slams. Difficult to counter is a very loose term here though. While these enemies' attacks may look powerful, parrying or dodging them is just as easy to do as it would be against any standard enemy. The thing that stands out most about these elites are the fact that they serve as specialized versions of the standard enemies. Some are sharpshooters whose arrows hit harder. Others carry massive spears and may have one or two more unique attacks, while others still may be giants who try to slam a massive mace on you. Their presence is one that helps to diversify the cast of samey enemies you're used to fighting. Though in actual combat, they act as nothing more than a hit sponge, present to slow down the pace of the fight. The other big thing that changes throughout the game is your level. This takes two forms, the level of your gear and the level of your character. The level of your gear is upgraded via the resources you gather through things like opening chests, and serves only as a stat boost to what you already have. Rarer resources like ingots can also be used to level up your gear to a different tier, allowing for different effects and yet more level ups, pushing your stats higher and higher. The other form of leveling up is the skill level your character attains. These levels are attained via XP gained from fighting, exploring, and looting, and give you 2 skill points per level, each one giving you the chance to unlock a new node on the Skyrim-like skill tree. Some of these nodes are straight up stat boosts, while others give you wholly new skills. These skills range from the ability to deal damage whenever you successfully parry an enemy, to stomping on their face whenever they hit the ground, or the ability to carry 2 two-handed weapons at once. None of them change the way you actually play the game. As stated above, Valhalla's combat never grows more complicated than the 1v all affairs you're introduced to at the start of the game. Elites are flashier versions of standard enemies which are no harder to fight, while the standard enemies gain nothing throughout the game beyond new weapons and the new animations that come with them. Enemies may grow in level and hit harder, but that is almost never an issue. Eivor gains skill levels with no effort. While he does gain XP through combat, he also gains it through just about everything else, from discovering new areas to completing quests. This means you can level up by doing things entirely unrelated to combat, which happens pretty consistently. This is to be expected from a level tree that doesn't top off until level 410 in the base game, and 466 with the 2 DLCs. Still, given the incredibly simple combat loop, the skill tree has no choice but to offer you skills which do nothing more than make the already simple combat even easier. Dealing damage with a parry only allows you to use the same moves to kill enemies faster. Carrying multiple two-handed weapons allows you to deal more damage, letting you kill enemies yet faster. This would not be an issue if the game were to force you to change up your playstyle in response to the skills you choose to unlock, or if the unlocks came with their own unique drawbacks. No enemy has any way of countering your skills beyond their already existing, overly telegraphed parry moves and easy-to-read attacks, all of which become easier to handle with each new skill gained from the skill tree. At no point in the game does this problem improve. If anything, it gets progressively worse. Each and every single gameplay mechanic that could introduce some unique challenge is completely overridden by these unlocks. Chain assassinations allow you to take out more than one enemy stealthily and in rapid succession without being caught. The advanced assassination allows you to take out elites with specific timing, without having to face them in combat at all. Combined with the stat upgrades, you become progressively more invincible by the end of the game, without being introduced to any new challenge. There was nary a point where I struggled to the extent of needing to try any standard combat encounter more than 3 times, even if I was slightly underleveled. This problem underserves the leveling system. Every last zone in the game has a level gate associated with it, with each new area having a higher gate than the last. This serves to guide you as to what sort of scaled power level you should expect from enemies. Presuming you complete enough objectives in each area, you will always easily be at least 10 to 20 levels above the next zone, guaranteeing the thing is a breeze before you even step foot in it. Since the combat is so simple, there is nearly no way to gain the upper hand on an enemy leveled far higher than you. You simply do not deal enough damage, nor do you have enough health to deal with anything they throw at you. There is no alternative way to approach enemies. They kill you, and that's that. It especially sucks when you're in an area suited to your level and you run into the occasional mini-boss, which tend to be 60 to 200 levels higher than you, depending on the point you're at in the game. Typically, the challenge mini-bosses serve in most games is interesting, because they possess some unique playstyle you may not yet have the gear or skill set to deal with. You're given the suggestion that you may be able to beat the boss even at your current level, but you're made to feel certain that it would be easier given enough time. Should you be able to beat the boss at a lower level, you feel heavily rewarded, but if you cannot, you resolve to come back. In Valhalla, this is not the case. Mini-bosses kill you as rapidly as anything higher level than you without much way to counter them, ruining the intrigue you could have gained from characters like the Viking woman mini-boss mentioned earlier. What makes leveling systems in action games and action RPGs fun is the suggestion that you could beat what's in front of you if you tried hard enough, regardless of what your level actually is. Valhalla doesn't even attempt to give you that respect, instead asking you to play another 10 hours before you can even look the challenge in the eye. This not only makes the gameplay dull and repetitive in a 110-hour game, but serves to give you less of a tangible feeling of connection to the world. You are a grizzled Viking in a foreign country, yet you tear through the opposition like a scythe through wheat. When that opposition grows more powerful, you outscale them in such a way that things couldn't even dream to touch you. There are whole systems in the game that I never explored because, truth be told, there was no reason to. There are separate abilities you attain in the game that give you unique moves, as well as set bonuses from wearing all of the same type of gear. Without bothering with any of this, I was still able to plow through anything put in front of me. It's a problem that extends past the combat as well. Given the absence of any kind of stamina meter, you're able to climb anything and everything from the very start of the game. You're able to scale the sides of the massive cliff faces surrounding your house in Norway with ease, and England is no different. While the skeletons laid on the face of the mountain may tell a story of the struggles adventurers had on their journey, the game doesn't care to challenge you with anything similar. The world wants to constantly suggest to you that you should stay on your toes. Enemies are constantly around the corner in this foreign land, and unless you make a sufficient number of friends, you will suffer. Yet the game doesn't seem interested in actually making you feel any of that suffering. The worst problems Eivor faces are all tied to cutscenes and story beats. This problem is perhaps best exemplified by the raids. They highlight the worst aspects of both the action and the exploration, while adding on another entirely irrelevant system to boot. As mentioned before, these things differ in no way from many of the raids you take part in through the story of the game. You enter your destination and hack and slash through a bunch of enemies to get to your objective. Where this feature differs is what your objective is, as well as a cosmetic difference in terms of how you arrive. Pulling up to the riverside of your destination in your longboat, you sound your horn, hopping out to gather all of the resources you can find within the raid spot. Now, these resources are meant to be somewhat hidden from the Viking raiders. Chests with heavy wooden lids are placed in churches and chapels to keep them away from easy reach. Each of these chests require 2 people, you and an NPC raider ally, to push it open and receive what's inside. Just like any treasure in the game, this can all easily be found by using Odin's Sight, allowing you to locate every last bit hidden even behind walls, without any need to search the environment. In this instance, the treasure hunting aspect of the game doubles as a main objective, as it is a necessary quest objective in order to complete these raids. As opposed to the actual treasure hunting, you are railroaded directly where you need to be constantly in these raids, and the combat, of course, does not engage you in any way more significant. So, what do these resources do? They allow you to construct new buildings in your Ravensthorpe settlement, letting you flesh out the place more and giving you new things to do in it. Only that would be the case had any of these inclusions unlocked any new gameplay elements with objectives different than what's already included at the start of the game. For example, you're able to build fishing and hunting huts in your settlement, places where you can track the wildlife you've caught as well as receive silver for your efforts, giving you new things to focus on as you explore and hunt for treasure. Only with the core gameplay loop being as it is, you will find more than enough silver simply questing and exploring naturally. This makes the reward irrelevant. On the exploration end, these inclusions simply give you another thing to check off your list as you hunt down the various animals spread throughout England. The hunting itself is not at all rewarding, given the ease with which you can find everything given Odin's Sight and Sunan. Another inclusion is the Roman artifact collector, who gives you more treasures to find around the world, allowing you to bring artifacts back to him for small rewards. Again, finding these treasures is made tedious by the presence of their locations on the map and compass. Ravensthorpe itself is actually not a bad inclusion. England is a foreign land, and having a place familiar to call home, which you're made to return to throughout the game, gives a sense of peace and familiarity to the player when they've completed an arc. This peace avoids making the entire island feel foreign and unforgiving. Further, the settlement aids in giving the player a clear-cut motivation for trudging through the game. You're exploring, fighting, and questing in order to aid in the proliferation of your new settlement. What sucks is how terribly fleshed out that settlement actually is. There are loads of NPCs who wander around it and talk to Eivor, though they generally have no importance beyond their physical presence and whatever irrelevant reward they introduce for a pre-existing gameplay loop. These characters do occasionally introduce quests and gameplay effects of their own, which tend to be rather interesting, quaint experiences that provide a nice little break from the rest of the game. Examples include the hunting woman, who tasks you with aiding her to find a white stag who ends up being only a figment of her imagination, as well as a tattoo artist woman whose father dies, and who grows uncertain as to what her purpose in life is without him. In turn, she stops offering her services, and you're temporarily locked out from getting any new tattoos. By talking to her and helping her through her grief, you re-unlock the ability to get tattoos. What sucks is simply how few and far between these quests and interactions actually are. They're only present with a select few members of the settlement. It also sucks how little there is to do in the settlement itself. All of the side objectives the settlement introduces encourage you to interact more with the world, but not the settlement itself, leaving you with a feeling of familiar strangeness every time you return. You see the same faces doing the same things every time you're there, though you rarely have any connection to them beyond the services they provide. Had Ubisoft done a bit more in encouraging you to actually do things within the settlement, such as minigames or asynchronous RTS tasks like resource management, they may have made you feel more connected to it as a home. As it stands now, it serves as nothing more than a quest hub to host your interactions with other core story important characters, and, well, to obtain new quests. This is a fact made all the worse by the quality of the story Ubisoft decided to tell. The story of Valhalla begins with Eivor's suffering. He loses his parents as a child and is later forced to fight his way back home with nothing but some pants and an axe after being kidnapped by that very murderer. Sigurd's story starts from a very, very different vantage point. While he was present for the raid that killed Eivor's parents, his father survived. He also just finished questing through the Mediterranean and has finally returned home to the land he will soon inherit. Eivor and Sigurd are brothers by adoption, though we find out rather quickly that they don't have much on which they can relate. At the start of the game, both Eivor and Sigurd are only interested in finding purpose in their lives. Eivor dedicates the 15 years or so following his parents' death seeking closure, while Sigurd travels the world seeking new experiences. Quickly, though, we find a rift develop between the two characters. Sigurd feels destined to achieve something beyond the wildest imaginations of the people in the town he grew up in, to surpass merely being their king and instead become a god. Eivor, on the other hand, is content trying to establish his clan's place in their new home. He finds purpose in serving others as much as possible, developing relationships and rooting his story in the land. The brothers quarrel and disagree, but they have to find a way to come together to achieve their common goals. Given Eivor's drug-induced prophecy of betrayal from the beginning of the game, it's as though the developers were actually trying to build some kind of narrative payoff into these characters' stories. That interesting premise is squandered by one main problem: the conflict between the Order of the Ancients and the Hidden Ones. Assassin's Creed is no stranger to long and complicated backstories, filled with loads of baseless lore and vague allusions to beings of celestial power. Valhalla, though, ramps it up to 11. While Sigurd's personal motive for coming to England is hidden for a decent bit at the start of the game, it is soon revealed without much hesitation. He believes himself to be a Norse god reincarnated. As a motivation, it doesn't run counter to the conflict already central to the plot. It's entirely possible to have Sigurd's potential delusion be another difference that drives a wedge further between the two brothers. Given Eivor's prophecy, it should lead into a nice amount of dramatic irony. This actually is how their story is treated in the beginning. The issue with this conflict is simply that it just doesn't square with the world Ubisoft has designed, or the characters in it. After stepping foot into England and establishing Ravensthorpe, your whole motive for traveling around the countryside and questing is to better establish your new colony, and to make allies to ensure safe ownership of your land. In Grantebridge-shire, the whole reason you're there is to re-establish the Norse Soma as the ruler of the land and to oust the unfriendly Anglo-Saxon ruler. They're your immediate neighbor, and ensuring peace with them is rather important. In Leicestershire to the north, you help two sons of the famous and now deceased Ragnar Lothbrok install a new king of Mercia, one who will have no choice but to be loyal to the Viking cause. It's a story woven naturally into the world, with certain camps in the zone actually being newly occupied by friendly NPCs as you complete more of the story. Sigurd is even present without much concern for his supposed destiny. Every character in these zones has a specific place in the world, and a specific job they're doing to help solidify that place. Ivar and Uba Ragnarsson are playing diplomacy makers and trying to craft the image of England to fit one more suitable to the Norse. The new Mercian king wants power and understands there's no way to avoid the rise in prominence of the Vikings. The old Mercian king desperately wants to hold on to power and is willing to do whatever necessary to ensure he can retain it. Even Eivor and Sigurd are only there to help spread the word of their new colony and ensure their neighbors to the north are just as friendly as their ones to the south. It is only in the next zone featuring Sigurd, Oxenfordshire, that his personal motives take precedence. It actually takes a while to get to this next zone. There's about 3 others I completed before heading there: East Anglia, London, and a secret one I'll get to later. Given how long it had been since I had seen Sigurd, I was starting to lose sight of what the central plot actually was, or Sigurd's role in anything that was happening. The only thing that really mattered to me was questing and learning more and more about the denizens of the land. When I finally did arrive in Oxenfordshire, I was met with a very conflicted zone. On one hand, there was actually a fairly interesting plot set up between the varying disagreed cultures. One leader had set up peace between the Anglo-Saxons and Danes, the two dominant cultural groups. But with his death came the subjugation of one group by the other. Intrigue and sabotage is had by the Anglo-Saxons to try to suppress the Danes so they can rule everything on their own. Unfortunately, this unique dynamic is fleshed out no further given the importance of Sigurd. He doesn't care much for what's happening, and only wants to help out the Danes to secure a mysterious stone which is meant to help him unlock his godly powers. Eivor rightly questions Sigurd for making absolutely no sense, but the game is not interested in anything Eivor has to say. There is nearly double the amount of time dedicated to Sigurd's exploits in the zone over the naturally built-up quarreling. This dynamic remains a problem for the entire story. Simple characters flesh out the world and give voice to its conflicts, while the core plot drives forward on something the player has no reason to care about. Eivor has no reason to believe Sigurd's powers exist, and the player has no reason to care. We're shown England and its people and asked to interact with them, not gods and otherworldly powers. Well, sort of. What I've failed to mention thus far is the fact that Eivor himself gets visions from Odin during certain story beats, or when he is assassinating any of the various Hidden One's targets throughout the game. It's unclear whether or not Odin's actually real. The first hint of him comes at the start of the game when Eivor has some weird PTSD dissociation moment. In every other instance where he is there, he speaks to Eivor and gives him counsel on hard decisions. He's sort of like an inner dialogue for Eivor, and his presence actually aids Eivor's character as he interacts with the rest of the characters in England, as opposed to detracting from it, like with Sigurd's powers. While his surreal presence works in his interactions with Eivor, the game does little to connect any of it to what's going on with Sigurd. Sigurd is acting like a maniac, obsessed with his own destiny, while Eivor is a man conflicted between two aspects of his own psyche. When Sigurd is kidnapped by someone he thought he could trust at the end of the Oxenfordshire arc, the most interesting aspects are the identity of the man who okayed his kidnapping, King Alfred, and the toxic dynamic it furthers between the Norse and the Anglo-Saxons. His deific aspirations feel sort of arbitrary. The fact that he's kidnapped by the woman, Fulke, who promised him knowledge of the stone he sought out, does not at all feel relevant to the story of the zone. Yet it's the only primary plot event driving us to continue on questing in the next number of zones. Those next few zones do nothing but drive the wedge further between the core plot and the story being used to build the world. Your next few options for zones after Oxenfordshire are Kent and Shropshire. Shropshire has one of the more in-depth stories in the whole game adjacent to the main plot, while Kent serves as nothing more than a device to advance that main plot. In Kent, you team up with Basim, one of the two assassin men, and the one who had been pushing Sigurd so hard to find the stone in Oxenfordshire to try to reactivate his powers. One of the more important things that happens in this whole zone is Basim sharing some of his backstory with Eivor. At a campfire one night, he tells Eivor how he lost his son, and that his only driving motivation is attempting to avenge him. The only other prominent NPC in the whole zone is a monk, who's assisting you in order to get in bed with the incoming government, so he can have a bit more influence on how everything works. He thinks the best way to go about this is to have Eivor and Basim siege the castle of the man who is meant to be the new Reeve of the Shire. While raiding his keep, the monk is meant to ride in gallantly and save the day, earning the respect and favor of the Reeve in the process. Only, the Reeve kills himself, thinking to have been legitimately captured by the Vikings, and the monk is left mortified by what he's done. It's a funny encounter, but much like Oxenfordshire, it is cut way too short, given the focus on rescuing Sigurd. The final moments see you fighting a force's captor, Fulke, sends against you while she escapes. In Shropshire, the moment you step foot in the main town, there's a weird standstill sort of conflict going on. People in green coats are flanked by the typical red-coated Anglo-Saxons you're used to seeing out and about in the world. There's not quite any fighting going on, but it's clear people are making their best attempt to interact with one another without wanting to slit the other's throats. The person who called you to this land was Ivar Ragnarsson, one of the two men you aided in replacing the king in Oxenfordshire. He informs you of a long-running conflict between the two cultures in the land, the Britons to the west and the Anglo-Saxons to the east. Just recently, the Earl of the Anglo-Saxon end died, and the King of the Britons is weary to accept peace. His brothers had been kidnapped by the Saxons, and he expects his return if there is to be any stillness of blade. The man who is meant to replace the Earl is none other than the new King of Mercia's son, Ceolbert, making this the first time he'd be involved in politics in any official capacity. Making matters even worse is Ivar's bloodlust. The scar on his face was caused by a wound inflicted by that Briton king, and Ivar is not the type to accept apologies. The issue grows worse when, in spite of Eivor's best attempt to play diplomat, Ivar slits the throat of the king's brother in front of the king himself. The king obviously is not willing to take this lightly. He declares war, and the only thing your side can do in the face of the king's overwhelming force is to employ guerrilla tactics. You burn down one of the villages belonging to him and destroy much of the force guarding the mines where he makes all of his money. The king decides to withdraw his force to his primary castle, leaving your side room to settle camp in the village you raised and wait for a message of surrender. One night, though, troubled by all of the killing, Ceolbert goes out for a hunting trip to clear his mind. Much time passes and he doesn't return. You go out looking for him, and when you finally find him, he's laying in a cave, half dead. As you carry him back to the camp, he passes. It becomes clear to everyone that it was a last-ditch surprise attack from the king, and they resolve to storm the castle on the morrow. They easily overwhelm the king's forces, given their newfound rage. Ivar claims the right to kill the king. He bests him in one-on-one combat and flays him in the style of a blood eagle. Only when Ivar is done, he admits to Eivor that he is the one who killed Ceolbert. The only reason things got to this point is because Ivar wanted chaos and revenge for what the king had done to him. Eivor then kills Ivar in the lengthiest and tensest battle I've seen in the entire game. In leaving, the Shire is entrusted to the bishop who was originally brokering the peace between the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons. In the end, everything is left in ruins and there is no clear victor. What stands out most to me about the difference between these two zones is the connection the characters have to it. Basim and Eivor have no reason to care about the monk they're working with or the people of Kent beyond needing to find Fulke. When the monk asks them for help, they have no real interest in actually becoming friends with him or forming an alliance. They're simply doing a job to reach their quest objective. When Eivor is in Shropshire, his whole goal is to make a long-term ally for his new colony. As such, he's made to navigate a complex social game between people who all have incentive to own the land and who all have incentive to hate each other. Kent ends in a cliffhanger seeing the death of the monk at the hands of Fulke and her escape, while Shropshire ends in a bloody mess where nearly every major player ends up dead. What happens in Kent almost runs counter to what Eivor's job is in England. While it's true that he's searching desperately for his brother, he's also meant to make friends in the land to attain some strong foothold in their new home. When he's interacting with the monk, he quite literally has no care for his wills or whims beyond what he has to find his enemy. Kent feels like a linear romp, where the characters are only present to act as aids or roadblocks to the uniquely important end goal, while Shropshire feels like a complex interweaving of political bickering that ends in most friends you attempt to make being buried. In spite of the quality of zones like Shropshire, it highlights another issue found at the crossroads between the gameplay and the way the story is told. It's sort of confusing that everyone trusts Eivor the minute he arrives, and allows him in consultation for their most important and even kingly issues. It begins to make sense, however, when you consider the fact that he is essentially a god, and is able to complete every task everyone throws at him with ease. Therein lies one of the biggest problems with the tone of the game. Even though it is an Assassin's Creed game, you're still meant to be a hardy Viking, come from a world of cold, who faces hardship in a foreign land. You do not face any of these challenges in the gameplay, though, because it is an Assassin's Creed game and it is not meant to be challenging. The sole time your gameplay efforts are ever recognized in character interactions is to deem you a godly powerful man, yet not to give you influence befitting one. Your power is not an issue in itself, nor is your status among the characters you befriend. The issue is the stark difference between your insane levels of power and everyone else's. Still, it's something that's never questioned. While your only reputation in Shropshire comes from what Ivar has presumably said about you, the bishop trusts you immediately in consultation on the most important issue in his land. Yes, Eivor's a friend of the men the bishop is meant to trust, but how is he to know that Eivor is reliable enough to be sent off to speak with the king the bishop is warring against? What's even more frustrating is the fact that only one of these two zones ties back into what's ultimately going on in England. After your fight in Shropshire, there's almost no reason to go back or to interact with any of the other characters. What matters to you is Sigurd. In spite of how well developed the characters in Shropshire are, the ones who remain anyway, they're given no narrative payoff with the central plot in any way, shape, or form. When you ultimately track down Sigurd and Sussex, many of the important characters from the different zones in the game do come to help you. Yet, there's no narrative advancement given to almost any of them. They're your allies, tired of war but assisting you to fulfill their political obligations. They're friendly but not happy, and they're really only here to help. You do finally get to meet Guthrum Jarl, though he does nothing more than call you a headstrong moron and leaves. And at this point, he's probably correct. Eivor is getting antsy about saving his brother, but it's hard to tell why. Eivor does have a close relationship with his brother, but he's normally incredibly level-headed no matter the circumstance. When he gets to Sussex, he's arguing with Guthrum and charging headlong into stupid battles, getting his allies killed. Yet there's no precedent for him acting like this when he's under pressure. It's a character trait that feels like it's only present to be changed, as he suddenly grows back his level head later in the zone to the admiration of Guthrum. When Eivor finally does find Sigurd and kills Fulke, it's hard to feel like there's any narrative weight attached to what's happening. It's cool that Eivor can finally see his brother again, yes, but the only reason he got into this mess in the first place is because of some stupid hubris for powers none of us even have confidence exist. Even worse is the intensity they try to give to the death of Fulke. She talks of her ultimate mission and how she was the messenger for the Ancient Ones, and with her death things will only get worse. Okay? Again, they've done nothing to flesh out this character or give us a reason to care about anything happening with the Order of the Ancients. She dies and you gain Sigurd. One less arm and all. You finally return to Ravensthorpe to reconcile with him, intending to speak of what he experienced and getting him reaccustomed to being a leader. Instead, he immediately berates you for doing his job for him. He starts to question where your loyalties lie, and whether you were merely trying to become leader while he was away. This is when a few important Ravensthorpe story moments become important. Early on, you start to develop a romance with Sigurd's wife, the woman who sends you out on the missions you've been going on. You have the choice to sleep with her. Yes, of course I did. It's not clear whether or not Sigurd is aware of this when he gets back, but he doesn't want anything to do with his wife. This isn't too much of a change from previous, where he still wanted nothing to do with his wife, but it's impossible to tell if it's now because of what you've potentially done. On the other hand, there's a character you were close friends with in Norway who begins to question your actions in England. Dag. During the start of the East Anglia arc, a force from the zone comes to attack your settlement. You fight them off handily, though when given the opportunity to keep one of the men alive for questioning, Dag immediately kills him, speaking of retaining the settlement's Viking honor. Later, while helping to settle a petty dispute, Dag grows just as frustrated as Sigurd is now with your actions, questioning your motives. He challenges you to a duel of which he ultimately loses and dies. You have the choice here to send him off with axe in hand or to not, effectively giving him a warrior's death or denying him it, something which Sigurd pays great attention to when talking to you. Sigurd has his conversation with you about all you've done wrong. It's a neat furtherance of the friction built up early in the game and helps to heat up a plotline left in the dust early on. It's clear to see what Sigurd's mad about, and for once it isn't hard to relate to him. After that, he leaves. He heads off to the forest next to the settlement to reflect. You speak to him, and he tries to give you some understanding of the powers he has allegedly had awoken in him thanks to Fulke. He speaks of his greater purpose and his knowledge of his past lives, but only makes vague allusions to the immensity of it all. When you're done talking to him, that's it. You can wait until the next day, come back to Ravensthorpe to speak to him again. No matter what you do, he's entirely silent. He says nothing to you. You're left lost as to what you're meant to do next or where the plot is supposed to go. There is no indication for what's going on. After looking it up, it turns out the main plot goes on hold for now. Specifically, it goes on hold until you finish nearly every other zone in the entirety of England. Yes, the wedge mentioned before is made into an entire wall. You're now literally blocked off from doing anything with the main story until you finish content entirely unrelated to it. This took me another 40 to 50 hours, no exaggeration. Yes, it is technically possible to have finished many of these other zones first, but most of them are of a higher level gate than Sussex, meaning that wall really was intentional to some extent. It's no joke to say that everything from here on out feels like a chore in pursuit of some sort of resolution to the saga you've been on for 50 to 60 hours already. Making the best of it, let's talk about one of the zones that stands out the most between here and the end, and perhaps one I like even more than Shropshire, Gloucestershire. The zone is filled with the Druids, characters who are unique in a different way than those you've experienced thus far. While most of the unique enemies you've run into up to this point have occupied alternate ethnicities and cultures, the Druids have a full-on alternate religion. This means that not only do the NPC's character models change, it also means that where and how they fight is drastically different. Instead of roaming the roads in squadrons, they hide underground and perform dark, typically murderous rituals. These characters' unique religious habits set up for a lot of conflict between them and the church. Specifically, the Shire has been run by a druid up to this point. He's to be sacrificed in the next harvest festival, and his replacement is going to be a Christian man. As far as you can tell, the Christian is not sympathetic to the Druids, and wants nothing more than to be a devoted man to Christ. After getting drunk with him one night to try and grow closer, he winds up missing. After some quick investigative work, it turns out that the Druids are the ones who kidnapped him. While at first it seems as though it was only a group of ragtag Druids that captured him, you quickly find out that the whole thing was orchestrated by the Druidic Earl himself. Influenced by his lover, they kidnapped the Christian, worried that he would subjugate the Druids as soon as the current Earl performed his sacrifice. Their solution was to kill him and have the Earl's lover become the new leader of the Shire. You track her down, and your encounter with her is the final boss fight of the zone. You have the option to kill her, though doing so will leave behind a parentless child. A child born out of passion, the existence of whom the Earl keeps a secret. Whatever your choice, the Earl still burns in the Wickerman at the end of it all. What starts as reasonable concern over the charitability of the recently populated religious group in the zone, the Christians, turns into a sacrificial plot that only serves to make the Druids look worse. Still, the new Christian Earl promises to look favorably upon the Druids, no matter what the previous Earl had done. It's a story less broad-reaching than that of Shropshire, but its short length helps to make that story quite dense. It's an acceptable distraction from the main story, the incompleteness of which is beginning to make the back of my head throb. What two zones stand out most to me during this segment, though, are ones which shirk the conventions Valhalla has set up for itself. These zones are Vinland and Asgard/Jotunheimer. One of these is actually a collection of zones as opposed to just one, but I'm going to roll them up here. Asgard and Jotunheimer, specifically, shirk the conventions of story delivery in the game. As stated, the stories in many of the zones in England do not pertain to the overarching narrative. It's as though the design of the world necessitates a more localized, small-scale approach to storytelling with loads of little tales built on top of one another, while the larger story the developers wanted to go for did not fit within that structure. In Asgard and Jotunheimer, it's quite the opposite. To enter into either of the areas, you must drink a potion in the seer woman's hut in Ravensthorpe, falling asleep after you do so. It is in your drug-induced dreams that you are able to enter either of these zones. Asgard comes first. Waking up, you find yourself embodying Havi, the progenitor to Odin. The story begins with you being told of your ultimate fate by the Nornir, the mythical weavers of time. You will die fighting a massive wolf on the eve of Ragnarok. Immediately after you're shown this prophecy, an ice troll army attacks. Fighting them back, you find Loki, the man who was meant to guard the portal the trolls came through, and a person who resembles Basim. With him is a man known only as the Builder, who came through the portal with the trolls, and claims to want nothing more to do with them. He claims to be able to put up a magical shield around the whole of Asgard that will protect its people from further attacks. What follows is perhaps the most well-delivered driving plot in the whole game. It's a story told like an Old Norse myth, with characters acting not out of their place in society, a complex interweaving of emotions and interests, or with regard for their personal capacities or any other combination thereof. Each one of the gods act out of some simple, typically selfish desire to address their fears and desires. Javi is scared of anything resembling a wolf, given his prophecy. He meets a wolf pup who Tyr, one of the other gods who resembles Sigurd weirdly enough, imprisons. The wolf grows rapidly and eventually manages to escape, running rampant throughout the streets of Asgard. Javi catches up to and fights the wolf, though when he's about to land the final blow, Loki marches forward to proclaim the wolf as his son. Given Javi's pact with Loki, agreeing to never shed his blood, he does not land the final blow on the wolf. Instead, he has Tyr chain the wolf on a different island, for which he needs a strong chain forged by a dwarf from the footfall of a cat and a seed from an old tree. On the other end, the builder requires sacred water to enact his shield and to provide a demonstration for what he is able to do. It is at the well where he gets the water that he finds the wolf pup. Bringing the water back to the builder, he demonstrates his abilities, and yes, he is able to form a shield. It does attract a troll attack, but it works. In exchange for building a shield that will cover the whole of Asgard, the builder requests the hand of Freya in marriage, a proposition which Eivor accepts. Freya is none too happy about it, but Javi's too busy fighting the wolf and having it chained to listen to her. In the climax, Eivor offers a Freya-disguised Loki for the builder to marry. He sees through the disguise and refuses to finish the shield. Instead, you and Loki resolve to finish it yourselves, knowing where the builder keeps his secret paint. Along the way, you discover that it was actually Loki who let the builder into Asgard in exchange for the safe harbor of his son. Javi finishes the spell, and with all of the other gods out of the way, the builder reveals himself to have been a massive troll all along. Angry with Javi for having slain many of his people, he attempts to kill him, revealing that the spell was not meant to keep the trolls out, but to keep the gods in. What works so well about this whole zone is it's the first instance of the developers actually being able to blend the theming of the overarching mythical tale they wanted to tell with the story of the people who live within the zone. The characters are powerful and act out of hubris, but they live in Asgard where magic resides in everything and trolls attack regularly. Javi is terrified of his fate and resolves to chain up Loki's son for all eternity, in spite of how it might make Loki feel. The builder is mad about the gods' selfishness in ruling the lands, and tricks them in order to get revenge. It's one of the few instances in the game where the story actually manages to pick you up and sweep you away, leading you to forget just how much time you spent with it. The only issue with the zone is how poorly fleshed out the environment is. The exact opposite issue the bulk of the game faces. Entire sections of the zone are dedicated to nothing more than cute nods to tidbits from Norse lore, with sections that resemble housing blocks having no apparent use. Following the builder's defeat, Javi decides to head off to Jotunheimer in search of magic, which will allow him to bind his fate to the Tree of Life, allowing him to be born anew following Ragnarok. This next zone comes a fair while after the first. To put the time you must wait into perspective, Asgard may be played immediately after East Anglia, while Jotunheimer comes after Sussex. The gap did lead me to forget a bit of what happened in Asgard, though this isn't too much of an issue given how simple the story in Jotunheimer is. Following an encounter with the wife of Loki and the mother of his wolf son Fenrir, as well as Loki himself, Javi encounters a different troll woman who tells him of a mead that contains the magic he seeks. Only problem is it lies within a sacred vault owned by the king of the trolls, making it an impossibility to attain. Javi manages to trick said king into befriending him by bringing him a stolen gift from long ago, a mug whose size changes depending on your perspective. To get into the vault itself, Javi sleeps with the troll king's daughter. With the mead secured, Javi is made to fight the king who has become aware of Javi's trickery, as well as Loki who intends to block Javi from using the magical mead. Defeating both, Javi sacrifices his eye in order to give the mead its magical power. Jotunheimer is a zone with a story as complete as Asgard's, though it doesn't feel nearly as fleshed out as its predecessor. Javi is in a foreign land with selfish goals, neither of which makes him many friends. The ones he does make, he betrays near instantly, so he may get what it is he seeks. This doesn't allow for characters with much development or backstory. What is better about Jotunheimer than Asgard is how well fleshed out the zone is. Many of the areas within it are still nothing more than the acknowledgements of old tales, yes, but there's actually a number of cities where trolls live lives clear for the player to see. All of the side content in the zone is better blended for it, as it pertains to the lives and environment of the trolls. Rounding everything out, Javi returns to Asgard to leash a fully grown Fenrir for good. In the process, Tyr has his arm ripped off. Still, Javi is successful in chaining the beast without killing it. Javi is shown a vision of Ragnarok by the Nornir, who deride him for his success in escaping fate. He may have been successful, but it wasn't his to escape. What is perhaps the most interesting takeaway from the whole side story is the allusion to Sigurd being Tyr, Eivor being Javi, and Basim being Loki. Sigurd had his arm taken by someone he thought he could trust in Fulke, while Tyr had it taken by Fenrir, who he believed himself to have become friends with. Even more obvious are the character models used for each of the gods. The character model of Eivor is used for Javi with absolutely no changes. Tyr uses the same model as Sigurd with different clothes, and the same goes for Loki but with Basim's model. It's the first tangible suggestion the game gives you of Javi and Tyr being the ancestors of Eivor and Sigurd. The gods feed themselves into the life tree, and the Norsemen we know from the main story may be their reincarnation. What's not so clear at this point is how all of this pertains to the main plot. It's clear that it must relate in some way, though the hints given are vague enough to not make clear how it does. Still, it was the first sequence that made me feel invested in the main plot. The constant referencing of gods and powers was finally made manifest in a world where it made sense for people to have powers. The other zone that stood out to me the most was Vinland. Asgard and Jotunheimer were a massive shock to me when I discovered them originally. I initially did not even expect the game to start in Norway, so getting to travel to places of literal myth in a heavily grounded history-based game was very surprising to me. Discovering Vinland was a whole other level of excitement. For those who aren't aware, Vinland was the Old Norse name for America. In Assassin's Creed games, it's common for the world to only depict one specific, typically small splotch of land in a specific time period. At most, you get one or a few cities to travel within. Learning that I would not only get to explore an entirely different and utterly unique area on top of England, Norway, and Asgard, but that it was the exact land I had played the entirety of Assassin's Creed 3 in, marveled me. It's a unique place and a unique period of time that most people just aren't incredibly familiar with. America was a vastly unknown place to Europeans, leaving this time period pretty undocumented. So the idea that you could explore this place in this period as a Viking was incredibly exciting. Made even better is how utterly unique the zone is. In traveling to Vinland, you learn that you must wear a disguise and keep none of your regular gear. The settlement in the land is actually run by Kjotve's son, Gorm, from the beginning of the game, and any detection of your presence would lead to immediate arrest and death. As such, you enter Vinland with nothing but a tunic and your fists, and you're tasked with tracking down and killing Gorm. In that way, it's similar to the very beginning of the game. Given your combat nudity and lack of friends in the land, much greater emphasis is put on your reliance on the environment to survive. Just like in the main game, you must invade and steal from enemy camps to get resources. While normally these resources get you nothing more than unrewarding upgrades, in Vinland they are the currency you use to attain any gear in the first place. A much greater emphasis is put on hunting as well, an activity you almost never need to partake in within the main game. There, the amount of resources you get from the animals you kill could easily be outclassed by just running into an enemy encampment, slaughtering a few people, and yoinking what you need. In Vinland, depending on how good you are at stealth, you don't have that option early on. If you're found with nothing more than your fists and a shirt, chances are you'll die in 1 or 2 hits with nearly no way to fight off your attackers. This zone is also rather short. It can probably easily be completed in 2 to 4 hours if you're not interested in doing everything. This is a pretty important note, as once you do attain all of the gear you need, the zone is no longer difficult. You're not nearly as strong as you are in the main game, but you're still more than strong enough to take out any number of guards you could need to. The other interesting part of this zone is the fact that you need to track down Gorm. There are many different enemy encampments in the zone, and the one in which Gorm resides is a mystery. What this does is force you to become well acquainted with the zone. Fast travel is an option, but you're only able to fast travel to approximately 2 corners of the map and right about nothing else. Everything else is up to you. You must either travel by boat to where you need to go, or brave the forests filled with bears. You're also not given the luxury of having your main longboat filled with all of your allies, meaning the boat you choose is a random rowboat, so you can gradually explore the land until you find Gorm. Once you do, and once you kill him, you're free to return to the main game unless you care to do any of the side content in the zone. The story here is fine, but very light. Eivor makes friends with some natives and works with a man hurt by Gorm to find where he is. Gorm is in the land with a mining expedition, hoping to find a buried wall where an Order of the Ancients orb is meant to slot in to unlock secret powers. After killing him, Eivor refuses to use the orb and discover what's on the other side. Instead, he gives the treasure over to the natives and tells them of a tale of his gods using the orb as a prop. After he's done, he hands it over to them and takes his leave. What matters about this zone is not the story it has to tell, but the way it recontextualizes what combat means in Valhalla. Up to this point, it has been nothing but a power fantasy, while Vinland shows how much the system is capable of. Given the right balancing, the game can be made to feel like a survival game, with everything you do taking a significant portion of effort and time. It feels like a visage of what Valhalla could have been, were it not for the rather arbitrary RPG system placed into the game. There are other zones to finish before the end of the game, but many of them are just more and more examples of the same formula demonstrated by everything else I've brought up. Yervashire is a tale of a king gone mad, with no one being able to tell if his worry of betrayal is grounded. Turns out it is, just not from where he expected. Essex is the tale of a king who wants nothing more to do with his wife, as well as her with him, and orders her kidnapped by you and your allies in order to free the both of them of their marital obligation. They're all fun and unique plots, but none of it ties into the main story in any way. Yet this is all you will be working with until you finish everything. Well, technically you're not meant to finish literally everything, though you do need to complete at least enough to unlock Winchester, something which can be done at nearly any point given you've completed Jorvik. You also need to be high enough level to complete the zone though, which itself is higher level than any other zone in the game beyond the final one. Winchester itself isn't a bad time though. Following in the footsteps of London, both Jorvik and Winchester task you with defeating a certain number of members of the Order of the Ancients who have embedded themselves into the social hierarchy of the cities. What sets Winchester apart is who tasks you with finding and defeating these members. It's the man you find your primary enemy throughout the game, at least in a distant, story-driven sense. King Alfred. Enemy of the Danes and seclusionary scholar King Alfred tasks you, a Viking, with taking out the scourge which has infected his city. In turn, he will foster a peace with the Viking cultural bits of England. It's not a very long plotline, Winchester, nor is it particularly depthy. The members are all that of standard Winchester society and play no real role in the greater plot. When you finish your task and return to Alfred for peace, he promises it to you, so long as you convert to Christianity. If you refuse, he promises to kill you then and there. Old habits, I suppose. You manage to escape the city, though one thing remains clear. No matter what it is you do, you will not manage to befriend the Christian king. You will either succumb to his might, or he will be subjugated by your ferocity. Back in Ravensthorpe, Sigurd finally speaks with you once more. He tells you that it's time to return to Norway so he may see his father once more and fulfill his destiny. The end is finally here. What follows, though, is a long, long series of events which lead up to and constitute that ending of the game. Much of it is necessary, though it encompasses every single plotline related to the main story in mostly every way. Instead of trying to walk through the whole thing in detail, I'm going to give a sort of quick bullet point rundown and flesh things out more where necessary. Sigurd and Eivor land first in Horðafylka, the land of Harald Fairhair to whom Sigurd's father ceded his land. Sigurd finds his father in a bar, drunk. He derides his son for never being present, while Sigurd derides his father for ceding their land and losing him his birthright. Both Eivor and Sigurd refuse to forgive their father or understand his side at all, leaving him in sorrow as both of his children leave. It's a level of maturity demonstrated by their already foolhardy mission. Sigurd hints at what lies at their ultimate destination in the north of Horðafylka, and speaks for the first time with Eivor about both of their visions. Eivor speaks of the fated betrayal from his vision at the beginning of the game, and promises Sigurd he will do nothing of the sort. The two of them speak at great length during the next stretch of their travel, marking the first time in the whole game the two have been seeking a common goal. Sigurd still sounds like a madman, though Eivor is much more sympathetic to his cause given his own visions. The both of them travel through harsh snow to a cave, in which holds a door of ancient make. Sigurd speaks an ancient tongue to open it, and Eivor recognizes it from a memory of a past life, marking the first time these ancient myths have had any tangible, present grounding in the portion of the game we already know for sure is real. At the center of the cave, the two find ancient technology, which Sigurd promises will help them achieve Valhalla. Hooked up to the machine already is the mother of the seer woman from Ravensthorpe. Within the machine, Eivor wakes up in some hall that resembles the make of something you would have seen in Asgard. He recognizes Sigurd, while the seer woman's mother is revealed to have been the reincarnation of Freya. Eivor pauses to look over all that is before them, and admits to Sigurd that his visions were correct the whole time. The two find themselves in a Groundhog Day scenario, where they repeatedly drink the same mead and partake in the same battles. At the end, the day resets and they do it all again. Only, every single cycle, Sigurd loses the same arm in various different ways. Eivor also recognizes his father, and attempts to track him down cycle after cycle, eventually losing the same eye as Havi. After a few cycles, Sigurd brings forth a fake version of Eivor's father. Eivor sees through the visage, and grows frustrated with the unclear, simulated nature of life in this machine. Freya shows him a vision of all of his friends from Ravensthorpe present in the halls, which Eivor determines to be fake, and all of the specters turn to dust. Eivor finds and speaks with Sigurd once more, and convinces him to leave the machine with him. As they decide to leave, Odin appears, denying them exit. He attempts to convince Eivor to stay, wanting to be present with Eivor for all of eternity as they bask in Eivor's great accomplishments. When Eivor declines, a fight with Odin ensues. The only way to win is to unequip your axe and run through a door to exit, slashing Odin on the way out. He tries desperately to convince Eivor to stay so he may keep hold of his immortality, but Eivor leaves as Odin fades away. Back in the real world, Eivor awakens to find Basim holding Sigurd hostage with a knife to his throat. Basim blames Eivor for his son's death. A boss fight then ensues that is a bit too mechanically intensive for the combat system Valhalla has to offer. Basim runs away to find Sigurd once more. Chasing him down, both you and Sigurd coordinate a counterattack in order to hook Basim up to the machine and turn it off, leaving him to rot for a millennium without quite dying. With Eivor having suffered some grave wounds from Basim, both him and Sigurd reconcile once more. Sigurd has a newfound groundedness about him as his grand ambitions have been washed away. He has seen his destiny and he's turned it away. It is at this point that Sigurd judges a few decisions you've made throughout the game. Whether or not you left your father's resources in Norway as you left for England initially, whether you refused to sleep with Sigurd's wife, whether you gave Dag an honorable death by allowing him his axe in death, whether you followed Sigurd's orders in Oxenfordshire and did not combat him, and whether you contested a harsh ruling Sigurd gave when he returned to Ravensthorpe. If you chose the right decision at least 3 times, Sigurd declares you Jarl and decides to stay in the settlement. If not, he tells you he will leave the settlement and not return. Eivor reflects on the prophecy he was told at the beginning of the game, while Sigurd tells him he cannot change fate. It turns out Eivor's betrayal was just denying him Valhalla. We're not nearly done yet, though. There's a modern-day segment in Valhalla, just like any other Assassin's Creed. It's mostly irrelevant to the plot except for the very end, where it serves solely to be driven by the mythical lore in the game. Basically, the world is getting really hot. In order to fix it, our modern-day replacement for Desmond, Layla, settles on finding the machine Eivor and Sigurd attain Valhalla through. Traveling to the machine and hooking herself up to it, Layla finds a glitched-out version of the Valhalla from before. In it, she finds the Nornir and Basim. Turns out it was Basim that had given her a message in the first place, leading her to the grave of Eivor and allowing her to live out his memories. Basim makes Layla touch something. With that, he disappears. She runs into something called the Reader, a human silhouetted ball of light who reads all possible timelines for humanity. He is looking for a way to save humanity, and she stays with him even in spite of her losing a staff thing that was keeping her alive. The Reader is Desmond from the old games, basically. In the real world, 1,000-year-old Basim awakens, and using the talking healing staff Layla had, he ages himself back to his youth. He meets up with Layla's friends, and somehow gives them a voice memo where Layla says she's fine. Her friends don't like him, but he's there, modern day and all. He somehow knows of modern technology like the Animus, and speaks to Eivor's grave about how he will find his children, and how he won in the end. He's also in love with the voice inside of the staff. Back in the Animus, Sigurd relinquishes both the title of Jarl and his wife to Eivor. Eivor makes a speech to the population of his settlement as they sing for their new Jarl, reflecting the start of the game.
For those who fight and those who fall.
This is all a lot to take in.
The game dumps about everything it can think of on you within the last few hours. It's paced well, but if you've forgotten any one of the various plot lines that are being tied up, it would be hard not to be confused as to what is going on. Yet, to my mind, it is the only point in the game where the main plot is given any justice. Up to this point, Eivor and Sigurd cannot get along because Eivor frankly has no clue what Sigurd is talking about half the time. He's only ever concerned with his status as a god and how he's meant to come back to his former glory, while Eivor is busy attempting to gain political standing in their new home. It's impossible for the two of them to find common ground because there is no ground in the game for them to stand on. Eivor's feet are on the soil in England, while Sigurd's head is stuck too far in the clouds to even see where his footing is. While Eivor does see his own visions, Sigurd's obsession with making his a reality borders on schizophrenic delusion. Ending their prophecy, and their bickering, by proving Sigurd was capable of accomplishing it may very well have been the best decision the developers could have made. It should be evident that I was not a fan of Sigurd's character in England. He felt ham-fisted, and it was impossible to relate to the motivations behind his actions. Still, giving both characters their time to reckon with and accept their lineage gave a whole new context to their story, and made it significantly easier to relate to. Surprised as I was by its storytelling intellect, the game did wrap up their conflict in a satisfying way. Still, it's disappointing this is the first time the player gets to relate to Sigurd since the beginning of the game. While he did seem genuinely interested in sticking up for Eivor in Norway Part 1, Sigurd seems to forget he even exists when he realizes he can fulfill his prophecy in England. A prophecy whose veracity is hidden from the player until the very end of the game. It's true that Odin is present in Eivor's mind for a significant portion of the game, but there really is no way to prove that any of what's happening is real. Even at the end, it's unclear as to whether or not Odin is real. Yes, he attempts to block Eivor from leaving the simulation, but it could very well be some sort of manifestation of his subconscious struggling with his conscious mind. This is perhaps a bit less likely given Havi and the Lot giving their souls to the life tree in Asgard, but there also is no guarantee that Eivor is the reincarnation of a god, besides himself declaring it so, I guess. Though I suppose all of that ambiguity is thrown out the window when Basim gets carried over to the modern day. I guess that guarantees he's the reincarnation of Loki? Still, none of Eivor's encounters with Odin, either in the bulk of the game or at the end, validates Sigurd's supposed legacy. Eivor is on an island all his own with his potential status as a god, and this makes it impossible to relate to Sigurd up until the very end. Sigurd is given no plausible deniability with his desire to be a god. This makes his climax a whole lot less rewarding. If the game had put any more effort into validating the existence of gods outside of the minds of Sigurd and Eivor, this would not be near so much of an issue. Or the game could have focused more on fleshing out Sigurd's place in the world as opposed to letting him run wild, pursuing his fantasies with no other characterization. As it stands, the game refusing to take a stance on either fleshing out Sigurd or the metaphysical portion of the world makes both suffer as a result, and it makes Sigurd's ending that much less satisfying. The other big issue is how overwhelming the story is while reaching its climax. Spacing out the ending better would have helped the player to buy into the mythical aspect of the story far earlier, but it also would have given the rest of the ending room to breathe. Bunching it all up into one massive ball of story reveals serves to make it easy to lose track of what's happening and to fatigue your interest. Still, it's true that holding some information from the player is a useful aspect of the story structure. While it's true that revealing the truth behind Sigurd's vision earlier would have done great work in making him easier to relate to, the climax is still built up through by Eivor's lack of belief. It could also be said that the Asgard arc is proof enough of Sigurd's claims, though I'd think a dream sequence could easily be explained away as just that. Even with all of that being true, it just moves the pressure for spacing out the ending to some other part of that ending. Would having Basim go crazy earlier in the story and disappearing ruin the pacing? Would Sigurd waiting to judge Eivor's actions throughout the game until they returned to England have done so? Maybe they could have waited to have Layla find the Valhalla machine until after Eivor and Sigurd returned to England. For all its flaws, the ending does do a fantastic job in wrapping up a story the game clearly had no clue how to deliver. Focused on fleshing out England, the developers seemingly needed some way to motivate the player to travel from area to area building up political connections, and the ending made that story feel worthwhile. Regardless, it's unfortunate that the game made no attempt to tie the stories of those disparate zones into the main plot, or even to one another, in spite of making up a bulk of what's in the game. Sussex was an interesting attempt at interweaving the various narratives across the land, but the lack of character progression on anybody's part but Eivor's made it feel more like a crossover episode than a story beat. When you return to England, in spite of the conclusion of the driving plot, there's actually one more zone to complete: Hamptonshire. Surrounding Winchester, the aforementioned home and political stronghold of King Alfred, it's a pillar of Anglo-Saxon power. It's also the highest level zone in the entire game at level 340, 90 levels higher than that of the city it encapsulates. Guthrum has spent the entirety of the game doing nothing but planning an invasion of the area, being the primary reason he's absent in all zones but Sussex. By the time Eivor returns from Hordafylke, that invasion is ready to go. Before his departure, the seer woman comes to speak to Eivor about her vision of the battle ahead. She warns him that even though he may win this battle, he will ultimately end up losing the war. It's an ominous prophecy, and the first that actually ends up holding up. While the ever-so-powerful Eivor may come away unscathed, the same cannot be said for many of the friends he's made along the way. The entirety of the zone is filled with death. If Sussex was the crossover episode where many of the friends you've made throughout England meet for the first time, this is the Game of Thrones moment where the majority of them come to die. It's also the first time you're going out of your way to help your allies as opposed to them helping you. This is Guthrum's fight, and you play only one part of the puzzle that will lead to Alfred's demise. With all that being said, the zone's story starts with an agreement for a ceasefire. Alfred pays Guthrum a Danegeld, a large sum of money in admission of defeat, while Guthrum agrees to leave the town they've taken and relinquish it to Alfred. It is only when Alfred tells Guthrum that he has killed Ubba Ragnarsson does Guthrum fall back on his word. Ubba was one of the men you aided in replacing the king in Leicestershire, someone who shows up frequently throughout the game to aid you and who you gradually come to know as a friend. You and Guthrum's men slaughter the remaining Anglo-Saxon soldiers as Alfred flees, sacking the city and leaving it in ashes and ruin as you go. Fleeing and making camp in a nearby forest, Eivor sends word to his many allies that the heathen army needs all of the help they can get. There is meant to be a war against Alfred, and Guthrum intends to take his throne. Their plan is to take Chepim, the city to which Alfred has fled, in order to recoup and gather his forces. Eivor takes care of many of the guard camps surrounding Chepim, while his friends travel to the region, clearing the way for a siege. While you're out and about, you can actually find the body of Ubba in the exact spot Alfred said he would be, at least a dozen spears suspending his body upward in a haunting visage of his moment of death. It's a neat form of natural storytelling with no cutscene needed to make you feel sad, something oh so lacking in Valhalla. After the preparations are done, battle is made rather quickly. Characters from the majority of zones show up, even ones you've completed after Sussex. Even battle-adverse characters are there, like the bishop from Shropshire. In camp, you coordinate out your plan of attack. On an evening a few days from now, a feast will occur in Chepim. You'll all approach quietly through the fields. Guthrum and a few others will capture Alfred's thanes, local leaders from around Wessex, who have come to attend the feast. The men you met in London will take the garrison. The rest will scout ahead to watch for reinforcements or help where need be. In the moments before battle, you give a speech to the lot of your allies and prepare for war. The battle may very well be the lengthiest you've encountered up to this point. The format plays out the same as any other raid you've partaken in throughout the game. Fight off enemies and carry out the simple objectives until everything is done. What is different is exactly what you're doing in this raid. Typically, your objective might be stealing treasure or killing some specific target. In this battle, your objective is multi-layered. You must both carry out your own tasks while aiding your allies with theirs. First comes the matter of confronting Alfred. Entering the Church of Chepim, you see he is nowhere to be found. In his stead is his right-hand man who tells you that Alfred has escaped, that this feast was actually a trap, and that the king of the Anglo-Saxons is gathering his allies for a counterattack as we speak. It's a warning as ominous as the seer woman's. Killing Alfred's right-hand man in a boss fight, you exit the chapel to find the entire city embroiled in a fiery battle. Soma, the woman you helped in Grantebridgeshire, is fighting a horde of soldiers right in front of you, falling momentarily in front of them. As she stands back up, she's stabbed twice, once through the stomach and again through the chest. There's no time for sorrow, though. Fighting rages through the whole of the town, and it's up to you to ensure no more of your friends die. For the rest of the battle, you're asked to do a few different things in any order you please. Guthrum needs help capturing the last of the Thanes in the town hall. The men of London need the garrison gate destroyed in order to block off reinforcements. Lastly, you're called to help Hunwald, the alderman of Lincolnshire, who has sustained severe damage in the battle. As you finally make your approach, his wounds have grown grievous. He speaks vaguely of feeling cold, and in the following moments, he passes. Earlier in the story, you helped him deal with his father's death. So too must you now deal with his death as he succumbs to his wounds in some shack in the outskirts of the city. Taking out a few more Anglo-Saxon soldiers, the fighting is done and Alfred's force falls. As the dust settles, you find one more fallen amongst those you called allies. Hjor, one of your main friends in the fight against the Order of the Ancients in Jorvik, and an old friend of Eivor's from Norway. You're given a chance to speak to everyone involved in the battle, and while Guthrum is surely happy about his victory, the rest of your allies have grave words for what has befallen them. Death and sacrifice, all in the name of a war-forged peace. It may be the only way for the Norse and Danes to find safety in their new home, but it is one which no man hoped they would have to sacrifice themselves for. These are your friends, not Guthrum's, and they have lives and interests beyond this cultural conflict. Many of them, including the bishop from Shropshire, are Anglo-Saxon and Christian themselves. To men like him, the war was merely about maintaining alliances and not securing some deeper peace for his people. In the end, even Guthrum takes pause to reflect on the chaos that has just occurred, reflecting on Alfred's calm piety and questioning whether or not adopting his religion and culture would have led to a more peaceful resolution to their conflict. Even in the context of this lengthy video essay, it's hard to convey the impact these deaths have. In a game spanning 110 hours, even 2 or 3 hours isn't enough to cover every last area and story arc, and even if it were, a summary doesn't equate to spending so many real-life hours with something. It's entirely possible for you to have met certain characters 80 hours ago in terms of your real-life time spent with the game, as was the case with Soma. When she dies, it isn't quite like seeing a friend die, but it is like seeing the end to a story you've spent years with. Of course, you're not going to be spending years with this game, but 80 hours is about the time dedication you'd expect from someone reading all of A Song of Ice and Fire. And given how people react to seeing their favorite Game of Thrones characters dying, it's hard to say that Valhalla wouldn't create a similar feeling. It's hard to say that these deaths have an important narrative quality. After all, it is sort of ironic that a game which sees you doing nothing but killing people the whole game decides to finish on a quaint sentiment about sacrificing your friends to war. Regardless, there is a unique feeling communicated through the exhaustion you feel finally crossing this finish line. It's sort of like the game is telling you you're finally done. Those characters you met so long ago, their stories are finally done. You can rest now. For what it is, it's a good ending. It ties up the many different plot threads laced throughout England all at once, similar to what the first ending did with the primary plot. It gives vindication to the many, many hours you spent with the game up to this point. Juxtaposed against the first, it is disappointing that this ending was not treated as any more important. It's an ending many people may not see. You unlock it only after completing that first ending. Yet, it's arguably the most satisfying of the two. Possibly the most satisfying of all three. Huh? What? Oh yeah. There's a third ending to the game which you can only unlock at the end of your mission to kill the many members of the Order of the Ancients embedded throughout England. Some of these members are defeated as a part of the main plot. For example, the 3 city zones in the game, all of which I've spoken of to some extent, see you killing members of the Order in a very similar format. You're called to London, Jorvik, and Winchester in response to letters from a poor fellow soldier of Christ to weed out 3 members of the Order of the Ancients in each town. This isn't nearly all there is, though. The identities of the rest of the members is something you're meant to hunt down using clues from the members of the Order you have to kill as a part of the main story, all of which can be accessed in a tree that diagrams the complete number of members. The clues you gain tracking down the members encompass many different aspects of the gameplay, from simply talking to people or finding letters to winning a game of the dice game Orlog to figure out where to go next. The Order members themselves do not typically fight back, and when they do, they're rather weak. The main gameplay effect they introduce is kind of playing detective, while also acting as a replacement for the assassination targets you'd expect from an Assassin's Creed game of yore. Given how little these characters are fleshed out though, they're way less satisfying to deal with. You must also kill 16 Zealots of the Order. Zealots are an interesting addition to Valhalla. They're diagrammed on the outer edge of the Order tree, and while they aren't quite primary members of the Order themselves, you must still kill all of them to finish dealing with the Order. As opposed to the actual members of the Order, the Zealots fight back when they're attacked. They roam specific areas of the map and have a boss-style health bar that pops up at the top of the screen when you encounter them. Some are easy to find, and all of them are easy to fight given you're at the right level. Think of them as the enforcers for the Order and the main mini-bosses of the game. They're also an incredibly annoying inclusion. Given the way the leveling system in the game works, nothing is a challenge when you're leveled past it, but everything becomes impossible when you aren't leveled high enough. Given the Zealots' unique powers, some can throw spears at you and dodge roll away from everything you have, some can block every attack you swing at them while others throw Molotovs at you, they are able to do a fair amount of damage to you that you generally just cannot counter. This is especially annoying with the projectile attacks. Until you unlock the ability to throw projectiles back at your target, there is no way to deal with them other than rolling away. The only real counter you do have against the Zealots is to kill them before they have the chance to overwhelm you, an impossibility if you're not leveled high enough to do enough damage to them. I really do mean impossible here. I had about 15 or 20 attempts at one Zealot leveled about 30 levels above me midway through the game. No matter what I did, I could not beat him. Even when I learned all of his patterns and was able to whittle him down to half health, I would run out of nearby plants to refill my rations and would die in 1 or 2 hits. It became a war of attrition that I was guaranteed to lose. When I was high enough level, that same fight became arbitrarily easy. I ran up to where he was and killed him in a matter of 15 or so hits, with him doing very little damage back to me. The hardest part of many of these encounters is the sheer amount of time it can take to hunt the Zealots down. In one instance, it took me a good 15 minutes to track one down that had a massive patrol route. I can see what the idea was with including these guys, but a lack of ability to defeat them early in the game, even when you're underleveled, is incredibly unsatisfying. The result of their inclusion makes them feel less like mini-bosses and more like yet another objective you have to complete to finish the game. Once you've taken down every last member in Zealot, you receive one final letter from the poor fellow soldier of Christ, telling you to meet him in a small village secluded in a swamp within Hamptonshire. He wants to reveal to you the identity of the final member and the leader of the Order in England, the Father, and to draw out a plan to defeat him. Arriving, you find no one. You search around the village for a little, but no one stands out to you. Confused, you rest for a while, hoping he'll turn up. Night turns into morning, and you're awakened by a woman teaching a man newly employed to her bakery how to cook a new type of pastry. She leaves, and in approaching the man, you find him to be King Alfred in exile. He's a stranger in this village, and he wants to keep it that way. He understands that if people find out who he is, it will lead only to more bloodshed over a land he's already lost. After some conversation, Eivor pieces together the fact that Alfred is the poor fellow soldier, having even sent himself a letter warning him of the Order's presence in Winchester to conceal it. After taking a few moments to accept this revelation, he's hit with another. Alfred is the father as well. It was a title he did not want, passed on to him with the death of his brother. As a godly man, he saw no great truth in the beliefs of the Order, and saw their mission as destructive. He sought to destroy it from the inside, to rid the island of its presence once and for all, and to live life clearly as a Christian man with no other obligations. Such was his plan before your attack. He devised the scheme as the poor fellow soldier to share the wealth of knowledge he had about the organization in secret with one he trusted would help to take it down. The war with the Norse meant Alfred himself could no longer carry out the plan, but it did mean he could use Eivor as his errand boy. In closing out their conversation, he gives Eivor a key to his keep in Winchester. Within it lay letters speaking of Alfred's motivation in picking Eivor. He was aware of the presence of a hidden one in Eivor's settlement, and believed their combined presence would be what was needed to topple everything. In giving Alfred more of a fleshed-out personhood and character, the game tied up every loose end it possibly had. It was a good note to finally end the game on. Alfred was a unique character with strange motivations through the whole game, seemingly one step ahead of everyone else at every turn. He was like a snake, yet he never seemed to bite all too hard. In speaking to him one final time, you can finally understand what it was that actually motivated him the whole time. Yes, he wanted to deal with the Viking threat, but it was always hard not to feel like something else was going on with the character. In fleshing him out, it made it possible to sympathize with the main enemy, as well as finally tying the Order of the Ancients to the main story. It didn't quite justify the disconnectedness between the two for the majority of the game, but it at least gave players who stuck around something. After all, isn't that the most you can hope for from Valhalla? It's very true that this feels more like a secret ending than anything else. It's a cute send-off, but one that still just held no narrative weight. Almost like an Easter egg, but with main characters and story bits. Still, finally finishing up the game invigorated something in me I hadn't felt since the beginning of it, that I had freedom in this world. In finally completing every ending of the game, I decided to head back to Grantebridgeshire to see if there was any new side quest or bit of dialogue giving closure to the death of Soma. There wasn't. Frustrated, I simply sat in the longhouse for a moment, reflecting on the ending of the game. In doing so, my attention was drawn to the many NPCs, dancing, partying, sitting, and speaking. I knew nothing of their stories, nor could I. They were simply coded to do their same mundane actions over and over. Yet, I found they were the only thing giving life to the longhouse I was in. I found that I could watch them do their quaint little dances for minutes on end without getting bored. It was though a new purpose was found for the halls I had stepped into so many tens of hours ago, all to help a defeated woman rescue the only thing she had to call hers. Now, instead of having some utilitarian purpose for existing within the game, this was simply a hall of merriment. It retained its importance without giving me anything to do within it. It was meant for me to gawk at and watch, but not to participate in. This encounter perhaps describes the game best. In spite of a lack of gameplay effects, the world stood out to me more than it ever had. There is an unmatched beauty in the design of Ubisoft's world of early medieval England. History was exhaled onto every hill, valley, and ruin as the developers sought to make not a playground for the player, but a storied world they could learn something from. Traveling back through portions of England like Grantebridgeshire, it's hard not to feel a bit underwhelmed thinking about how the game could have better used its many assets. Yes, the Longhouse itself has no gameplay effect, but the dead bodies, countless notes, abandoned camps, and large landmarks spread throughout the world also add nothing to tie the story or the gameplay to the world. For the gameplay it does have, the characters and mechanics are developed separate from the world, choosing instead to simply stage much of what happens in historical landmarks or camps, specifically designed for gameplay encounters that are recycled throughout the game. Instead of staging these moments in these interesting places, they're slapped into historical landmarks or camps that are just recycled throughout the game. It's as though a painter started on two different ends of the canvas, painting with two drastically different color palettes and styles, and finding no way to blend the two, leaving the middle as a sort of basic, muddled attempt at a complete painting. It's a problem even the end of the game cannot escape from. Why is it we should need two entirely separate endings for two significant portions of the game when the developers could have made any attempt to blend the two together? What's more, it's incredibly disappointing how much of a missed opportunity it was to not blend Eivor himself into this harsh yet beautiful world. The somber tone from the beginning of the game is utterly dropped, and the player's experience suffers for it. The worst encounter Eivor faces is his parents dying as a child. Everything else he does in the game is almost always a success, and when it isn't, it's not a fault of his own. The closest the game gets to revisiting that tone is in the England ending, where a few of the friends he made throughout the game die. Given their lack of importance to the central narrative, though, the greatest effect their deaths have is simply in the mind of the player who chose to spend this much time with the game. While it's great to have an ultra-powerful protagonist who can scale the sides of mountains and slaughter hordes of men with ease, it simply doesn't square with the harsh reality that was early medieval England. As sad as it is to say, Eivor as a character just isn't resolved by the end of the game. There was a tonal attempt at a closing chapter with him being made Jarl, and while it is satisfying given the amount of hard work he put into the settlement, it simply doesn't do anything to address the death of his parents or the trauma he seems to have faced as a result. Yes, he escapes his past with Odin, but we just don't see him settling down or living a life away from the one filled with brutality he's led up to this point. It doesn't seem like the developers were at all interested in letting you live the life of a Viking, in spite of setting up their game to seem like that's all you would be doing. At no point other than the intro, that is. Given how detailed, lengthy, and different Norway Part 1 is, it's hard to imagine what the developers were envisioning when they put it at the beginning of the game. Did they think a detailed, cohesive story with a satisfying conclusion only a necessary inclusion for the tutorial area? The rest of the game carries none of the linearity of Norway's opening story over to England, though it might have been better served for it. As it stands, it's the disjointedness that the majority of the game suffers from that makes it so unsatisfying to have to beat. Even now, I feel more rewarded having killed Kjotve than fighting Basim. I find it no mistake that the three other zones with the most rewarding gameplay loops and story beats are the ones which focus on worlds completely disconnected from England. It's like when a toddler with some toys makes up a story. Limit them to Barbie and Ken, and they can make a love story that would make even a grown man cry. Give them that whole box of Green Army men, and they'll have no clue what to do with them until they're old enough to know what the Vietnam War was. In reflection, it feels as though the developers wanted to make a digital museum exhibit, not a game. The sense of historical immersion the world itself gives you is unmatched by any other video game I've ever played, especially other Assassin's Creed titles. While the majority of the game does nothing to make you feel like a Viking, it does do a whole lot of work to make you feel like a spectator, a third party who merely gets to observe wax dolls and positions that tote what life was like back then. Only replace the wax dolls with 3D models replete with hundreds of thousands, or millions of polygons and complex scripting. If you do decide to play this game, I'd recommend you treat it as the digital museum it was meant to be. Only play so long as you remain fascinated with the world. Any time spent beyond that is simply a waste.